In the depths of the internet, hidden behind glowing screens and restless nights, there exists a story so terrifying and so captivating that it has haunted millions of people across the world for over a decade. It is a tale that begins with a simple video game created by one man in his darkest hour, a game about animatronic creatures that come alive in the night, hunting the player through flickering cameras and locked doors. But this story reaches far beyond pixels and jump scares. It is a story about tragedy, about lost children whose voices echo through empty halls, about a man consumed by his own creation, and about a horror so deep that it refuses to die. Five Nights at Freddy's is not just a game. It is a phenomenon that has reshaped horror entertainment, spawned countless theories, created an entire generation of storytellers, and refused to release its grip on our collective imagination. This is the entire story of Five Nights at Freddy's, a journey into darkness that began with failure and transformed into legend. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's cannot begin without understanding the man who created it, a game developer named Scott Cawthon who spent years struggling in an industry that seemed determined to crush his dreams at every turn. Scott was not a young prodigy who found instant success. He was a Christian father from Texas who worked tirelessly on children's games and religious entertainment, pouring his heart into projects that were meant to inspire and uplift. For years, he created colorful, innocent games featuring cute characters and wholesome messages. He believed in his work. He believed that he could make a difference through the games he crafted. But the world was not kind to Scott Cawthon. His games were criticized harshly, torn apart by reviewers who found his characters unsettling rather than charming. One review in particular cut deep, describing his animated characters as looking like creepy, soulless robots that seemed more terrifying than endearing. The words wounded him, but they also planted a seed in his mind, a dark seed that would grow into something he could never have imagined. Facing financial struggles and the possibility that his game development career was over, Scott Cawthon made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking away from the criticism, he decided to embrace it. If people thought his characters were scary, then he would make them truly terrifying. He would create a horror game, something completely different from everything he had done before. With limited resources and working alone in his home, Scott began developing what would become Five Nights at Freddy's. The concept was deceptively simple. You play as a night security guard working at a children's pizza restaurant called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a place filled with animatronic entertainment robots designed to sing and dance for kids during the day. But at night, these robots become something else entirely. They move through the darkened building with a single purpose: searching for the night guard. And if they find you, they will stuff you inside a mechanical suit filled with wires and metal parts, killing you in the most horrific way imaginable. The genius of Five Nights at Freddy's was in its simplicity and its understanding of what truly terrifies us. Scott created a game where you could not run, could not fight back, could barely even move. You were trapped in a small security office with limited power, forced to monitor security cameras to track the movements of four animatronic characters: Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. Every action drained your limited power supply, and if the power ran out before 6 in the morning, you were left defenseless in the dark with these creatures hunting you. The game was claustrophobic, tense, and absolutely terrifying. The animatronics moved with unnatural, jerky motions. Their eyes stared with an empty, soulless gaze. The atmosphere was thick with dread, punctuated by sudden, screaming jump scares that sent players leaping from their chairs. But beneath the surface horror, there was something else, something that would captivate players far more than the scares alone. There were hints of a deeper story, dark secrets hidden in newspaper clippings and phone messages that suggested something terrible had happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, something involving missing children and a tragedy that had never been fully explained. When Five Nights at Freddy's was released on August 8, 2014, Scott Cawthon had no way of knowing that he had just unleashed something that would consume the internet. The game was an instant sensation, spreading like wildfire across YouTube and gaming communities. Popular content creators discovered the game and shared their terrified reactions with millions of viewers. Markiplier, a YouTuber who would become synonymous with the franchise, played the game and screamed his way through the nights, introducing the horror of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to an audience that could not get enough. The game was affordable, accessible, and perfect for the streaming era. People did not just want to play it themselves. They wanted to watch others experience the terror. Within weeks, Five Nights at Freddy's had become a cultural phenomenon, dominating conversations and creating a fan base that was hungry for more than just scares. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand the dark mystery that Scott had woven into his game. The mystery at the heart of Five Nights at Freddy's was something that Scott had crafted carefully, leaving breadcrumbs of lore scattered throughout the game for players to discover. Through newspaper clippings shown on the walls and cryptic phone calls from a previous security guard, players learned about the missing children incident, a tragedy where 5 children had disappeared at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. There were whispers of a man in a costume who had lured the children away, of bodies never found, and of the restaurant continuing to operate despite the horror that had occurred within its walls. The animatronics themselves seemed connected to this tragedy in ways that were never fully explained, moving with a purpose that felt almost human, as if something was driving them beyond their programming. Players began to theorize that the spirits of the murdered children were trapped inside the animatronic suits, seeking revenge or trying to communicate their suffering. The story was dark, tragic, and endlessly fascinating, creating a mystery that players were desperate to solve. Scott Cawthon recognized the hunger for more content and moved with incredible speed to deliver it. Just 3 months after the release of the first game, in November 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was released, expanding the universe and deepening the mystery. This sequel was actually a prequel, taking place in an older location of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1987. The game introduced new animatronics alongside withered versions of the original characters, and it revealed more pieces of the dark puzzle. Players learned about the Bite of 87, an incident where an animatronic had bitten someone and caused severe injury, leading to restrictions on how the robots could operate. The second game also introduced the concept of giving life to the animatronics, suggesting that Remnant, a mysterious supernatural force, could bind souls to metal and machinery. The lore was growing more complex, and the community was growing more obsessed with piecing together the timeline and understanding exactly what had happened in this cursed pizza restaurant chain. The releases came at a breathtaking pace that seemed almost impossible for a single developer. In March 2015, just 4 months after the second game, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 arrived, jumping forward to 30 years after the closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The game was set in a horror attraction called Fazbear's Fright, where the owners had collected relics and artifacts from the original restaurants to create a twisted haunted house experience. The main antagonist was Springtrap, a decayed animatronic suit that contained something truly horrifying: the corpse of a man who had died inside it. Through hidden minigames, players discovered the identity of the killer, a man named William Afton who had murdered the children and hidden their bodies in the animatronic suits. In a twisted act of karma, William had been cornered by the spirits of his victims and had climbed into a Spring Bonnie suit to hide, but the suit had failed catastrophically, crushing and impaling him with its internal mechanisms. He died in agony, but somehow he did not stay dead. Trapped in the Springtrap suit, William Afton became a monster that refused to die, continuing to haunt the world decades after his crimes. The fourth game arrived in July 2015, and it took the series in a different direction, diving deep into psychological horror and childhood fears. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 placed the player not in a security office but in a child's bedroom, defending against nightmare versions of the animatronics that stalked through a dark house. The game was intensely personal and terrifying, relying on sound cues and split-second reactions rather than camera systems. But it was the story that truly captivated and confused players. The game appeared to show the tragic fate of a child, possibly the victim of the Bite of 87 or a similar incident, tormented by nightmares of the animatronics. The child's story was heartbreaking, showing his fear of the animatronics, his cruel older brother who tormented him with pranks, and ultimately a birthday party that ended in tragedy when the child's head was placed inside the mouth of an animatronic as a joke, resulting in a devastating bite that left him clinging to life. The game's ending showed the child dying, with the cryptic final image of a child's bedroom with all the toys and flowers fading away, suggesting the end of a young life cut short by cruelty and accident. By the end of 2015, Scott Cawthon had released 4 mainline games and several spin-offs in less than 18 months, a productivity that seemed superhuman. The Five Nights at Freddy's universe had exploded beyond anyone's expectations, becoming one of the most discussed and analyzed game series in history. The fandom was massive, creative, and deeply invested in solving every mystery Scott had hidden in his games. Theorists like Matt Pat from the Game Theorists channel dedicated countless hours to analyzing every detail, every hidden screen, every cryptic piece of dialogue, building elaborate timelines and theories about the true story of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The lore had become incredibly complex, with multiple restaurants, multiple incidents, multiple victims, and a timeline that seemed deliberately obscured and confusing. Players debated whether certain games were dreams or reality, whether the bite shown in the 4th game was the bite of '87 or a different incident from 1983, and what the ultimate fate of the children's spirits would be. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's was not just about the games themselves, but about the community that formed around them. Fan artists created thousands of pieces of artwork reimagining the characters and scenes from the games. Fan game developers created their own interpretations and spin-offs, some of which became popular games in their own right. Musicians composed songs inspired by the lore, with creators like The Living Tombstone producing tracks that garnered millions of views. The most surprising development was the way the community embraced the characters despite their horrifying nature, creating softer, more sympathetic versions of the animatronics and exploring emotional stories about their tragic circumstances as vessels for murdered children. The juxtaposition between cute and terrifying became a defining characteristic of the fandom, and it showed how deeply people had connected with the story beneath the scares. Scott Cawthon himself became an unexpected figure in the gaming community, someone who maintained a mysterious presence while also engaging directly with fans. He participated in discussions on forums, dropped hints about upcoming projects, and sometimes confirmed or denied theories about the lore. What made Scott unique was his willingness to evolve the story based on what resonated with fans while maintaining his core vision. He was not precious about his creation in a way that stifled creativity. Instead, he seemed genuinely excited by the interpretations and theories that fans developed. This relationship between creator and community became a vital part of what made Five Nights at Freddy's special, a collaborative storytelling experience where fans felt like active participants in uncovering the truth rather than passive consumers of a predetermined narrative. After the release of the 4th game, Scott announced that he was stepping back from Five Nights at Freddy's, suggesting that the story had reached its conclusion. But the break did not last long. In October 2015, a teaser appeared that would expand the universe in a completely unexpected direction. Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location was announced, a game that would explore a different facility with entirely new animatronics and a darker, more sophisticated story. Sister Location was released in October 2016, and it marked a significant evolution in both gameplay and narrative. The game introduced players to Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, an underground facility where highly advanced animatronics were stored and rented out for private parties. The animatronics in this location were different from the original cast, more human-like and dangerously intelligent, designed with hidden features that served sinister purposes. Sister Location revealed crucial information about William Afton, the man behind the murders, and his family. Players controlled Michael Afton, William's son, who had taken a job at the underground facility searching for his sister. The game revealed the tragic story of Elizabeth Afton, William's daughter, who had been killed by Circus Baby, an animatronic specifically designed by her father. Elizabeth had been drawn to the animatronic despite her father's warnings, and Circus Baby's hidden mechanisms had grabbed her and pulled her inside, where she died and her spirit became bound to the machine. The game's story was heartbreaking and disturbing, exploring themes of family, guilt, and the consequences of William Afton's obsession with life and death. The ending of Sister Location was shocking, revealing that the animatronics had been using Michael, scooping out his internal organs and using his body as a skin suit to escape the facility. Despite this, Michael somehow survived, his body decaying but animated by something unnatural, and he vowed to find his father and end the horror once and for all. The introduction of the Afton family transformed Five Nights at Freddy's from a simple horror story into a tragic family saga. William Afton emerged as a complex villain, a brilliant robotics engineer whose obsession with conquering death and creating life through his machines had destroyed his own family. His daughter Elizabeth was dead, trapped inside Circus Baby. His youngest son, often called the crying child by fans, had died from the bite incident shown in the fourth game. His oldest son Michael was left as a walking corpse, hunting for his father to end the nightmare. And William himself was trapped inside the Springtrap suit, unable to die, continuing to spread suffering wherever he went. The tragedy of the Afton family became the emotional core of the franchise, elevating it beyond simple horror into something that explored loss, guilt, revenge, and the impossibility of escaping the consequences of our actions. In December 2017, Scott released Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, a game that initially appeared to be a lighthearted restaurant management simulator where players could build and run their own Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. But this was Scott Cawthon, and nothing was as simple as it seemed. Hidden within the cheerful management gameplay was a darker truth. Players could salvage animatronics found in the back alley, bringing them into their restaurant without realizing they were collecting the most dangerous characters from across the franchise. The game culminated in a final confrontation where Henry Emily, the business partner of William Afton and co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, finally took action to end the horror once and for all. Henry had built a trap, luring all of the possessed animatronics into one location with the purpose of burning them all together, releasing the spirits of the children and ensuring that William Afton could never hurt anyone again. The ending of Pizzeria Simulator was powerful and emotional, featuring a speech from Henry Emily that served as a farewell to the characters and the children trapped inside them. Henry spoke directly to his daughter, Charlotte, who had been the first victim of William Afton and whose spirit had been protecting other children as the puppet, a mysterious animatronic that appeared throughout the series. He spoke to Elizabeth, trapped inside Circus Baby, offering her release from her prison. He spoke to the original 5 missing children, promising them peace. And he spoke to William Afton, now known as Scraptrap, condemning him to the flames and promising that this time there would be no escape. The building burned with everyone inside, and for a moment it seemed like the story had finally reached its true conclusion. A bittersweet ending where the innocent souls could finally rest, and the monster who had tormented them would be destroyed. But Five Nights at Freddy's was not finished. In June 2020, after several delays, Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted was released in partnership with Steelwool Studios, marking the franchise's first entry into virtual reality. Help Wanted was a brilliant meta-narrative that acknowledged the previous games while taking the story in a new direction. In this game, players learned that a game development company called Fazbear Entertainment had commissioned a VR experience to rehabilitate the company's image and dismiss the previous games as mere fiction created by a rogue developer. But something sinister was hidden within the game code. A digital entity called Glitchtrap emerged, a virus or consciousness that appeared to be William Afton himself, somehow surviving even the fire that should have destroyed him by transferring his essence into the digital realm. Help Wanted introduced a terrifying new concept, that William Afton could continue his evil even beyond physical death by infecting people through technology. The game's protagonist, a beta tester named Vanessa, became corrupted by Glitchtrap, transformed into a follower who would carry out his will in the real world. This development showed that Scott Cawthon and the team were willing to evolve the franchise beyond its original setting, exploring how the horror of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza could continue into the modern era through new technology. The game was critically acclaimed for its VR implementation, bringing the terror of the animatronics to life in a way that felt more immediate and frightening than ever before. Standing in a virtual pizzeria with animatronics approaching from all sides created an experience that was almost too intense for some players, proving that the franchise still had the power to terrify even after years of games. In December 2020, Security Breach was released after significant anticipation and multiple delays, representing the most ambitious entry in the franchise. Set in the massive Mega Pizzaplex, a multi-level entertainment complex that was part mall, part theme park, and part nightmare, Security Breach was the first game to feature free-roam gameplay where players could explore and run from threats, rather than being confined to a single room. The game followed a young boy named Gregory who became trapped in the Pizzaplex overnight and had to survive until morning while being hunted by Vanessa, now working as a security guard under Glitchtrap's influence, and a new cast of animatronics led by Glamrock Freddy, the only animatronic that helped and protected Gregory rather than hunting him. Security Breach was notable for its scale and its attempt to tell a more accessible story while maintaining connections to the deeper lore. The game explored the continuing influence of William Afton, who appeared as Burntrap, a horrifying amalgamation of his corpse, the Springtrap suit, and new technology, lurking in the depths beneath the Pizzaplex. The game also revealed that the Pizzaplex had been built on top of the remains of previous Freddy Fazbear locations, with the burned ruins of Pizzeria Simulator still existing in the underground sections. This connection to the past showed that despite attempts to move forward, the franchise and its characters were forever haunted by the tragedies that had occurred. The game featured multiple endings, some showing Gregory and Glamrock Freddy escaping together, others showing darker fates, and one showing a final confrontation with Burntrap where he appeared to be destroyed once again. Throughout all of these games, one of the most impressive aspects of Five Nights at Freddy's was how Scott Cawthon and the development teams managed to keep the core mystery engaging despite providing answers. Every revelation opened new questions. Every answer to one mystery created two more mysteries to explore. The timeline of events remained deliberately confusing, with games taking place in different years, showing different locations, and presenting information through unreliable narrators and cryptic minigames. The community embraced this complexity, treating the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's like an elaborate puzzle that required collaboration to solve. Timeline debates raged on for years, with fans analyzing every detail from the color of text in phone calls to the specific models of animatronics seen in background posters, all in an attempt to understand the exact sequence of events. The influence of Five Nights at Freddy's extended far beyond the games themselves. The franchise became a merchandising phenomenon, with action figures, plushies, clothing, and collectibles filling store shelves. What was particularly remarkable was how these products embraced both the horror and the cuteness of the characters, creating merchandise that appealed to young fans who loved the characters despite their frightening origins. The franchise also expanded into books, with Scott Cawthon partnering with author Kira Breed-Riley to create a series of novels that explored the universe from different angles. The original novel trilogy, starting with Five Nights at Freddy's, The Silver Eyes, presented an alternate timeline that explored similar themes and characters while telling a different story, allowing Scott to explore ideas that did not fit into the game timeline while still contributing to the overall mythology. The book series expanded further with the Fazbear Frights Anthology series, a collection of short stories that explored different aspects of horror within the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. These stories ranged from tragic to terrifying, exploring concepts like obsession, guilt, and the lasting impact of trauma. Some stories provided insight into how Remnant and the supernatural elements of the franchise worked, while others were standalone horror tales that used the franchise as a backdrop. The books became bestsellers, proving that the appeal of Five Nights at Freddy's was not limited to gaming but had become a true multimedia franchise with fans who wanted to consume content in any format available. One of the most ambitious expansions of the franchise was the long-awaited movie adaptation. For years, there had been talk of a Five Nights at Freddy's film, with various studios and directors attached to the project at different times. Scott Cawthon was heavily involved in the development, insisting that any adaptation had to respect the source material and the fans who had supported the franchise. After years of development challenges, the film finally entered production with Blumhouse Productions, a studio known for successful horror films like Get Out and the Purge series. The movie was directed by Emma Tammy and starred Josh Hutcherson as Mike Schmidt, a troubled security guard who takes a job at the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and discovers the dark secrets lurking within. The Five Nights at Freddy's movie was released in October 2023, simultaneously in theaters and on the Peacock streaming service. The film adaptation took a different approach from the games, focusing on a more traditional narrative structure while incorporating elements from across the franchise. The movie explored Mike's backstory, including the disappearance of his younger brother, and connected this personal tragedy to the larger mystery of the missing children. The animatronics were brought to life using a combination of practical effects and CGI, creating physical, tangible creatures that moved through real spaces. The film paid homage to the games with references and Easter eggs that delighted longtime fans while attempting to be accessible to newcomers who had never played the games. The movie's release was a major event for the fandom, representing validation and mainstream recognition for a franchise that had begun as an indie game created by one man. The film received mixed reviews from critics, who praised the practical effects and fan service but criticized the pacing and plot. But fan reception was enthusiastic. The movie was a commercial success, earning over $130 million domestically and becoming one of the highest-grossing horror films of the year. For many fans, seeing the animatronics on the big screen, watching Freddy and his friends move through a physical set, was an emotional experience that validated their years of investment in the story. The success of the film ensured that more adaptations would follow, with sequels already being planned to continue exploring the movie universe. Beyond the official releases, the cultural impact of Five Nights at Freddy's manifested in countless fan creations that kept the community engaged between game releases. Fan games became a huge part of the franchise's legacy, with developers creating everything from faithful recreations of the original games with new twists to completely original stories set in the universe. Some fan games, like Five Nights at Candy's and The Joy of Creation, gained significant followings in their own right, demonstrating the creative possibilities within the horror formula that Scott had established. Scott himself was supportive of fan game developers, offering encouragement and even featuring some fan games on his website, understanding that these passionate creators were keeping interest in the franchise alive and introducing new players to the universe. The music inspired by Five Nights at Freddy's became a phenomenon in itself, with numerous artists creating songs that explored the lore and characters. The Living Tombstones song, Five Nights at Freddy's, became a viral hit, garnering hundreds of millions of views and introducing many people to the franchise who had never played the games. Other musicians like JT Music, Try Hard Ninja, and Groundbreaking created extensive catalogs of Five Nights at Freddy's songs, each exploring different aspects of the story from various character perspectives. These songs became part of how fans engaged with and understood the lore, with some lyrics and interpretations becoming so popular that they influenced how the community perceived certain characters and events. The art community surrounding Five Nights at Freddy's was equally vibrant and creative. Artists created everything from faithful renditions of the horrifying animatronics to softer, more sympathetic interpretations that emphasized the tragedy of the children trapped inside the machines. A particular trend emerged of creating humanized versions of the animatronics, giving them distinct personalities and appearances that went far beyond their game counterparts. This artistic interpretation showed how the community had taken ownership of the characters, creating a shared mythology that existed alongside the official canon. Some artists focused on the horror elements, creating increasingly disturbing and detailed artwork that pushed the boundaries of how frightening the animatronics could be, while others focused on the emotional and tragic aspects, creating art that could bring tears rather than fear. The impact of Five Nights at Freddy's on the horror gaming genre cannot be overstated. Before this franchise, indie horror games existed but rarely achieved mainstream success. Scott Cawthon proved that a solo developer working with limited resources could create something that not only competed with big-budget studios but could dominate the conversation and create a cultural phenomenon. The success of Five Nights at Freddy's inspired countless developers to pursue their own horror game projects, leading to a renaissance of indie horror that brought us games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, Poppy Playtime, and many others that followed similar formulas of combining horror with mystery and deep lore. The idea that a horror game could build a massive, engaged community through mysterious storytelling and hidden secrets became a blueprint that many developers tried to replicate. The franchise also demonstrated the power of YouTubers and streamers in making games successful. Five Nights at Freddy's was perfect for content creation, with its short gameplay sessions, intense jump scares, and mysterious elements that encourage discussion and theory crafting. Creators like Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, and Dawko became synonymous with the franchise, introducing millions of viewers to the games and contributing to the ongoing conversation about the lore. The relationship between content creators and the franchise was symbiotic. The games provided endless content for creators, and the creators exposed the games to massive audiences who might never have discovered them otherwise. This dynamic helped establish the model of how indie games could achieve success in the streaming era, and it made content creator reactions a crucial part of marketing strategy for horror games going forward. The educational aspect of Five Nights at Freddy's was unexpected but significant. The franchise's complex lore and hidden secrets taught a generation of young fans how to think critically, analyze evidence, and construct arguments to support their theories. Fans learned to scrutinize every detail, to compare information across multiple sources, to collaborate with others to solve problems, and to revise their theories when new evidence emerged. The Game Theorists channel, hosted by MatPat, created dozens of episodes dedicated to solving the mysteries of Five Nights at Freddy's, each video presenting evidence, constructing timelines, and proposing explanations for the franchise's many questions. These theory videos became events in themselves, with fans eagerly awaiting each new episode and debating whether MatPat's conclusions were correct. The franchise essentially created a generation of amateur detectives who learned valuable analytical skills through their passion for solving the mysteries of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Scott Cawthon's personal journey through the creation and evolution of Five Nights at Freddy's was as remarkable as the franchise itself. From a struggling developer facing potential career failure to the creator of one of the most successful indie game franchises in history, Scott's story embodied the possibility of redemption and second chances. What made his success particularly meaningful was how he used it. Scott was known for his generosity, frequently donating to charity, supporting fan projects, and maintaining a humble presence despite his success. He engaged with fans directly, participated in the community, and showed genuine appreciation for the people who had embraced his creation. His approach to success was markedly different from many creators who achieved fame. He remained accessible, kind, and focused on creating content rather than building a personal brand. However, Scott's journey was not without controversy. In June 2021, public attention focused on Scott's political donations, which had been made to various political candidates and causes. The revelation led to backlash from some parts of the fanbase who disagreed with his political choices. Scott addressed the controversy directly in a statement where he explained his reasoning, defended his right to political participation, and acknowledged that he understood why some fans were upset. The incident was divisive, with some fans choosing to distance themselves from the franchise while others defended Scott's right to his personal beliefs. In the aftermath, Scott announced that he would be stepping back from public game development, passing the franchise to other developers while remaining involved behind the scenes. The controversy highlighted the complex relationship between creators and fans in the modern era, where personal beliefs and public personas are increasingly scrutinized, and where separating art from artist becomes a matter of ongoing debate. Despite the challenges, Five Nights at Freddy's continued to thrive under new development teams. Steelwool Studios took the lead on major game development, while Scott remained involved in story direction and franchise oversight. The transition demonstrated that the franchise had grown beyond its single creator, becoming something larger that could continue with new voices contributing to its evolution. The community remained strong, continuing to create fan content, develop theories, and support new releases. The franchise proved resilient, weathering controversy and maintaining its position as one of the most beloved and discussed properties in gaming. The themes explored throughout Five Nights at Freddy's resonated deeply with audiences because they touched on fundamental human fears and emotions. At its core, the franchise was about the consequences of actions, the impossibility of escaping the past, and the tragedy of innocence destroyed. The story of the missing children, murdered and trapped in animatronic suits, was heartbreaking and spoke to the horror of lives cut short and justice delayed. The story of William Afton, a man whose obsession with conquering death led him to destroy his own family and countless others, explored how ambition and pride can turn someone into a monster. The story of Michael Afton, trying to right his father's wrongs and free the souls his father had trapped, was about redemption and the possibility of breaking cycles of violence and tragedy. These themes gave the franchise depth that elevated it beyond simple horror, making it a story that could be analyzed, discussed, and interpreted in multiple ways. The supernatural elements of Five Nights at Freddy's, particularly the concept of remnant and how spirits could be bound to machinery, tapped into deeper questions about consciousness, identity, and what makes us human. The idea that a person's essence could be trapped in a metal shell, aware but unable to truly live or die, was a horrifying form of purgatory that created sympathy for the animatronics even as they terrorized players. The franchise explored questions about whether the children trapped in the animatronics were still truly themselves or if they had become something else through their transformation. It questioned whether William Afton, having died and been revived multiple times in different forms, was still the same man who had committed his crimes or if he had become a force of pure evil that transcended human identity. These philosophical questions added layers to the story that encouraged deeper engagement and interpretation. The design of the animatronics themselves was crucial to the franchise's success, creating characters that were simultaneously appealing and horrifying. The genius was in making them cute and childlike in design, which created cognitive dissonance when they became threats. Freddy Fazbear, with his top hat and bow tie, looked like he should be friendly and entertaining, which made his blank stare and relentless pursuit all the more disturbing. Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy each had distinct appearances that made them memorable and gave them personality even without extensive dialogue or characterization. The degradation of the animatronics across different games, showing them becoming more damaged, more exposed, and more obviously haunted, visually represented the decay of the company and the deterioration of any pretense that these places were safe or innocent. The contrast between the bright, colorful, family-friendly exterior and the dark, dangerous reality underneath became a visual metaphor for the entire franchise. The location of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as a children's entertainment venue was significant to the horror because it represented the corruption of innocence and safety. Pizza restaurants with animatronic entertainment were real places that many people had childhood memories of visiting, places like Chuck E. Cheese that were meant to be fun and magical. By taking that familiar setting and transforming it into a place of horror and tragedy, Five Nights at Freddy's created a sense of violated nostalgia. The game suggested that beneath the cheerful exterior of these childhood spaces could lurk something dark and dangerous, that the places meant to protect and entertain children could become their prisons and tombs. This subversion of a nostalgic, safe space into something threatening tapped into deep anxieties about trust, safety, and the hidden darkness that might exist in seemingly innocent places. The progression of the franchise showed Scott Cawthon's growth as a storyteller and his willingness to experiment with different approaches to horror and narrative. Each game tried something different in terms of gameplay mechanics, from the original static camera system to the vent crawling of the second game, to the single location focus of the third game, to the bedroom defense of the fourth game, to the task-based progression of Sister Location, to the management simulation of Pizzeria Simulator, to the VR immersion of Help Wanted, to the free roam exploration of Security Breach. This variety kept the franchise fresh and prevented it from becoming stale or repetitive. Each game offered a new perspective on the universe, whether it was jumping to different time periods, exploring new locations, or following different characters. The willingness to take risks and try new things was part of what kept the franchise vital and interesting even after multiple entries. The ending of Pizzeria Simulator, with Henry's speech and the burning of the building with all the possessed animatronics inside, represented a thematic conclusion to the original story arc. Henry's words about having a way out prepared for his daughter and the other children, about the darkest pit of hell waiting for William Afton, provided emotional closure for a story that had been building for years. The fire was symbolic, a purification that would free innocent souls and destroy evil, allowing everyone to finally rest. The fact that the franchise continued beyond this point, revealing that William Afton had survived again in digital form and that the horror would continue, was both frustrating and fitting. It reinforced the central theme that some evils refuse to die, that the consequences of terrible actions continue to ripple forward, and that true peace might be impossible when such fundamental wrongs have been committed. The character of William Afton as the central antagonist became increasingly fascinating as the franchise developed. He was not a simple monster but a complex villain whose actions stemmed from understandable human motivations twisted into something evil. His obsession with life and death, his desire to understand and control mortality, came from a place that could be understood even if his methods were horrific. The loss of his daughter Elizabeth seemed to have driven him deeper into his experiments with remnant and possession, suggesting that grief and desperation played a role in his descent. Yet he was also clearly cruel, luring and murdering children with no apparent remorse, creating animatronics designed to kill, and continuing his evil even after death. William Afton represented the horror of intelligence without morality, of scientific curiosity without ethical boundaries, and of how the human desire to cheat death can lead to the destruction of life itself. The role of Phone Guy in the early games deserves recognition as one of the most effective exposition devices in gaming. The cassette recordings of the previous security guard, speaking in a casual, friendly tone while describing increasingly disturbing safety protocols and incidents, created an atmosphere of normalized horror. Phone Guy's matter-of-fact explanation of animatronics moving at night, the proper procedure if you are about to be killed, and the various tragic incidents that had occurred at the restaurant, all delivered in a cheerful customer service voice, was darkly comedic while also being deeply unsettling. The eventual revelation that Phone Guy himself had died during one of his shifts, with his final recording capturing the moment of his death, transformed him from a helpful voice into another victim of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, someone whose warnings had not been enough to save himself or others. The timeline confusion and the debates about which game takes place when became a defining characteristic of engaging with Five Nights at Freddy's lore. Scott Cawthon deliberately obscured the timeline, presenting games out of chronological order and providing contradictory information that made constructing a definitive sequence of events nearly impossible. Some fans found this frustrating, wanting clear answers and a straightforward timeline. Others embraced it as part of the fun, treating the confusion itself as a puzzle to be solved. The reality was that the ambiguity allowed for multiple interpretations and kept the community engaged in ongoing discussion. Each new release potentially recontextualized previous games, forcing fans to reconsider their understanding of events. This approach to storytelling was unconventional and sometimes maddening, but it created a level of engagement that more straightforward narratives might not have achieved. The technological evolution shown across the franchise was interesting, with animatronics becoming more advanced and dangerous over time in the lore while also showing the decay and failure of these technologies. The spring-lock suits, animatronics that could function as both robots and wearable costumes, represented bleeding-edge technology that was also incredibly dangerous, prone to catastrophic failure that could kill the person inside. The more advanced Funtime animatronics with their hidden features and true purposes showed how technology could be designed with evil intent, created not to entertain but to harm. The progression to digital horror in Help Wanted, where William Afton existed as a computer virus, showed how evil could adapt and persist even as technology changed. The franchise suggested that technological progress did not mean safety or improvement, and that new capabilities could create new forms of horror. The puppet, also known as the marionette, was one of the most tragic and important characters in the franchise mythology. The puppet was possessed by Charlotte Emily, the daughter of Henry Emily and the first victim of William Afton, killed outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza while the other children were inside celebrating. Charlotte's spirit became the puppet, and unlike the other children who seemed confused or violent, she appeared to have purpose and awareness. The puppet was responsible for giving life to the other animatronics, placing the bodies of the murdered children into the suits so they could possess them. She was a protector, watching over the other children and trying to help them even in their cursed state. The tragic irony was that in trying to give the children a way to stay present and seek justice, she had also trapped them in a nightmare they could not escape. The puppet story added a layer of sadness to the franchise, showing that even attempts to help and protect could become curses when mixed with the supernatural horror that permeated Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Golden Freddy was perhaps the most mysterious and debated character in the entire franchise. This rare animatronic appeared differently from the others, manifesting as a slumped, ghostly figure that could appear and disappear without following normal movement patterns. Golden Freddy was associated with the fifth missing child, the one often called Cassidy in the games, and seemed to possess unusual power compared to the other spirits. The character's appearances were often accompanied by crashes or unusual game behavior, breaking the fourth wall in ways that suggested Golden Freddy existed on a different level than the other animatronics. Theories about Golden Freddy ranged from suggestions that two spirits shared the suit to ideas that this spirit was more powerful or more vengeful than the others. The ambiguity surrounding Golden Freddy's true nature and importance made this character a focal point for theorists trying to understand the deeper mysteries of the franchise. The evolution of the community's relationship with the animatronics showed how characters could be reclaimed and reinterpreted beyond their original horror context. While the games presented the animatronics as terrifying threats, the community often portrayed them as sympathetic figures, victims of circumstance who deserved compassion rather than fear. This reinterpretation was especially strong in fan content focused on the children possessing the animatronics, with stories and art exploring their confusion, fear, and desire for justice or peace. The animatronics became more than monsters. They became complex characters with personalities, relationships, and tragic backstories that fans wanted to explore and expand. This transformation from purely scary to emotionally resonant was part of what gave the franchise staying power, allowing it to mean different things to different people while maintaining its core identity. The merchandise success of Five Nights at Freddy's demonstrated the franchise's crossover appeal beyond its core horror identity. Children who might be too young to play the games or who could not handle the horror still loved the characters and wanted toys and plushies of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and the rest. This created an unusual situation where horror characters became beloved children's toys, sold alongside action figures from more traditional kids' properties. Parents sometimes struggled to understand why their children loved these characters from a horror franchise, but the phenomenon made sense within the context of how the community had embraced and softened the animatronics. The merchandise also served to keep the franchise visible and relevant, with new products appearing regularly in stores and reminding both fans and potential new fans that Five Nights at Freddy's remained an active and popular property. The representation of mental health and trauma in the franchise, while never explicit, was present throughout the story. Michael Afton's guilt over his brother's death and his quest to undo his father's evil could be read as a journey through trauma and the search for redemption. The security guards taking jobs at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza despite knowing the danger suggested desperation and lack of better options, reflecting real-world situations where people accept unsafe working conditions out of economic necessity. The children trapped in the animatronics represented trauma that could not be processed or healed, pain that persisted and twisted into something that hurt others. While the franchise never engaged with these themes in a therapeutic or educational way, their presence added depth and made the horror feel more grounded in recognizable human experiences. The fan game Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach Ruin, released as DLC in July 2023, expanded the story of the Pizzaplex and introduced Cassie, a new protagonist searching for her friend Gregory in the now-ruined entertainment complex. Ruin was darker and more horror-focused than the base Security Breach game, returning to the atmosphere of isolation and helplessness that characterized earlier entries. The DLC revealed that the Pizzaplex had been abandoned and had fallen into decay, with damaged animatronics and environmental hazards making navigation treacherous. The story revealed more about the Mimic, a mysterious animatronic AI that could imitate voices and behaviors, suggesting that not everything players had experienced in Security Breach was what it seemed. Ruin ended on a cliffhanger, with Cassie apparently trapped or betrayed, setting up future story developments and demonstrating that the franchise still had narrative momentum and new directions to explore. The upcoming projects for Five Nights at Freddy's promised to continue expanding the franchise in multiple directions. Additional games were in development, continuing both the story of the Pizzaplex and potentially exploring other time periods and locations within the lore. The success of the movie guaranteed sequels that would further develop the film universe and potentially adapt more of the game storylines for theatrical audiences. New books continued to be published, exploring different aspects of the universe and providing additional pieces of the larger puzzle. The franchise had become a true multimedia empire, with each new project feeding interest in the others and keeping the community engaged and growing. The challenge going forward would be maintaining the quality and mystery that made the franchise special, while continuing to produce content at a pace that satisfied fans hungry for more. Scott Cawthon's legacy extended beyond just the franchise he created. He demonstrated that independent developers could compete with major studios not through matching their budgets, but through creativity, understanding of their audience, and willingness to take risks. He showed how engaging directly with a community could build loyalty and transform fans into active participants in a shared creative project. He proved that horror games could be successful not just through scares but through mystery and storytelling that encouraged analysis and discussion. His approach to DLC and updates, often providing free content and bonuses rather than charging for every edition, built goodwill and showed respect for the fans who had supported his work. While his public presence diminished after the political controversy, his influence on indie game development and horror gaming remained significant and would continue to shape the industry for years to come. The lasting impact of Five Nights at Freddy's on popular culture was evident in how deeply it had penetrated the collective consciousness. References to the franchise appeared in other media, from television shows to other video games. The phrase Five Nights became synonymous with survival horror in confined spaces. The concept of haunted animatronics became a recognized horror trope that other creators explored and built upon. The franchise had created its own language and iconography that fans immediately recognized. From the specific designs of the animatronics to the sound of static cameras to the image of a security office with lights and doors. This cultural penetration was the mark of a true phenomenon, something that had transcended its medium to become part of the broader entertainment landscape. The theoretical framework that fans developed to analyze Five Nights at Freddy's represented a form of collective intelligence and collaborative problem-solving. The community worked together across platforms, sharing discoveries, building timelines, creating visual aids and diagrams, and constructing elaborate theories that attempted to explain every detail. This collaborative approach to understanding the lore created a sense of shared ownership and investment that went beyond simply consuming content. Fans felt like they were part of uncovering the story rather than having it told to them. This dynamic was intentional on Scott's part, and it transformed the relationship between creator and audience into something more like a partnership, where both sides were working toward understanding the complete truth of what happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The moral questions posed by the franchise, while often subtle, added philosophical depth to the horror. The question of whether the spirits of the children should be freed or whether they had a right to seek revenge was never definitively answered. The question of whether William Afton deserved any understanding or sympathy given what might have driven him to his actions was left for players to consider. The question of whether places and objects could become inherently evil through the terrible things that happened in them was explored through the recurring use of the same physical locations and animatronic parts across multiple restaurants and time periods. The franchise did not provide easy answers to these questions, allowing them to remain open for interpretation and discussion, which contributed to the ongoing engagement and analysis from the community. The sound design across all the Five Nights at Freddy's games was crucial to creating the atmosphere of dread that made them effective. The ambient sounds of the restaurants at night, the distant footsteps of animatronics, the static of security cameras, the warning sounds of systems failing, and the sudden crescendo of the jump scare audio all worked together to keep players in a constant state of tension. The original game's lack of a traditional soundtrack during gameplay, relying instead on ambient noise and the player's own breathing and heartbeat, created an oppressive silence that made every sound significant and potentially threatening. Later games introduced more varied audio design, while maintaining the principle that sound was as important as visuals in creating fear. The audio became so iconic that fans could immediately recognize which game and which character a sound belonged to, demonstrating how effectively the sound design had been integrated into the franchise's identity. The ethical questions around the in-universe company Fazbear Entertainment and their continued operation despite multiple tragedies provided dark commentary on corporate responsibility and the prioritization of profit over safety. The games revealed through various documents and recordings that the company knew about the dangers, knew about the incidents, and chose to continue operating, covering up problems and misleading both employees and customers. The willingness to allow night guards to work in deadly conditions without proper warning, to continue using animatronics that had been involved in violent incidents, and to build new locations over the literal ruins of previous disasters showed a corporation that valued its brand and profits over human life. This satirical element added social commentary to the horror, suggesting that sometimes the real monsters were not supernatural but institutional, companies that created and perpetuated danger through negligence and greed. The transformation of Five Nights at Freddy's from a single game into a sprawling universe with multiple interconnected storylines represented one of the most successful examples of franchise building in gaming history. What started as a simple survival horror game with light backstory had evolved into a complex narrative spanning decades, involving multiple families, locations, and forms of horror. The universe included not just the games but books that explored alternate timelines and filled in gaps, a movie that reimagined the story for a different medium, and countless fan interpretations that expanded the possibilities even further. The franchise had become large enough that new fans could enter through multiple access points, whether through gameplay, theory videos, fan animations, or the film, and find their way into the larger community and lore. The technical limitations that Scott Cawthon faced when creating the original game, rather than holding it back, actually contributed to its success. The use of static camera images with occasional movement created an unsettling, surveillance footage quality that made the animatronics feel more real and threatening. The limited animation made their movements seem unnatural and wrong, enhancing their horror. The simple mechanics of checking cameras, closing doors, and managing power created gameplay that was easy to understand but difficult to master, accessible to players of all skill levels while still providing challenge. These limitations forced creative solutions that ended up being more effective than if Scott had access to advanced technology and larger budgets. The success of Five Nights at Freddy's proved that constraints could drive creativity and that technical simplicity did not mean a lack of impact. The intergenerational appeal of Five Nights at Freddy's was unusual for a horror franchise. Young children who could not handle the actual games still loved the characters and engaged with less scary fan content. Teenagers found the games perfectly calibrated to their taste for horror and mystery. Adults appreciated the complex lore and the nostalgia elements related to childhood entertainment venues. This broad appeal across age groups created a diverse fan base with different ways of engaging with the franchise, from young kids collecting plushies to adult theorists writing thousand-word analyses of timeline details. The franchise managed to be different things to different people while maintaining a coherent identity, a difficult balance that few properties achieve. As the franchise moved forward, the challenge would be maintaining the delicate balance between providing answers and preserving mystery, between honoring the original vision and allowing evolution and growth, between satisfying longtime fans and welcoming new audiences. The core appeal of Five Nights at Freddy's had always been the combination of accessible horror, deep mystery, and tragic storytelling wrapped in a package that encouraged community engagement and creative interpretation. As long as new content continued to provide these elements, the franchise would likely continue to thrive and capture the imagination of horror fans around the world. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's ultimately transcended the games themselves to become a story about creativity, community, and the power of stories to capture our imagination and refuse to let go. It was a story about how failure could transform into success, how one person's vision could inspire millions, and how a simple idea could grow into something far larger and more meaningful than anyone could have predicted. The animatronics that had once been criticized as creepy had become beloved characters known around the world. The simple survival horror gameplay had spawned a genre of imitators and inspired countless developers. The mysterious lore had created a community of dedicated fans who treated unraveling its secrets as a collaborative quest. Five Nights at Freddy's had become more than entertainment. It had become a cultural touchstone, a shared experience that connected people across the world through their love of mystery, horror, and the tragic tale of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The journey of Scott Cawthon before Five Nights at Freddy's was filled with both hope and disappointment, a long road of attempts at success in the game development world that seemed determined to reject him at every turn. Scott was not a naturally cynical person or someone drawn to darkness and horror. His background was in Christian game development and children's entertainment, creating wholesome content that he hoped would inspire and bring joy to players. He had created numerous games over the years, working tirelessly to improve his craft and find an audience that would appreciate his work. But the game development industry is brutally competitive, and for every success story there are thousands of developers whose games disappear without notice, whose years of work result in projects that earn barely enough to justify the time invested. Scott's games before Five Nights at Freddy's showed his ambition and his dedication but also revealed the challenges he faced in finding his niche. He had created a series called Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., featuring cartoon animals running a lumber business. The game was meant to be charming and fun, a management simulation with cute characters that would appeal to families. But when reviews came in, they were harsh, with critics pointing out that the character designs were unsettling, that the animals looked lifeless and creepy despite being intended as cute and friendly. One review specifically mentioned that the characters looked like soulless animatronics, a criticism that cut deep but also planted the seed for what would come next. For most developers, such harsh criticism might have been the end, the final sign that it was time to give up and find a different career path. But Scott Cawthon made a different choice. The decision to embrace the criticism rather than be defeated by it was the turning point in Scott's career and the origin moment of Five Nights at Freddy's. If his characters were being called creepy and robotic, then he would make them intentionally terrifying. He would take what had been seen as a failure in his character design and transform it into the central concept of a horror game. This decision required courage because it meant abandoning the type of games he had been making for years and venturing into a genre where he had little experience. Horror games were dominated by big studios with significant budgets. Games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill that created fear through detailed graphics, complex gameplay, and extensive sound design. How could a solo developer with limited resources compete in such a space? Scott's genius was in understanding that horror did not require expensive graphics or complicated mechanics. It required atmosphere, tension, and a sense of helplessness. He designed Five Nights at Freddy's around limitations, creating a game where the player was confined to a single room, unable to move freely, forced to rely on security cameras with limited power. The animatronics moved through the building unseen except for brief glimpses on cameras, creating fear through anticipation rather than constant visibility. The jump scares were effective not because of photorealistic graphics but because of the tension that built before them, the growing dread as power dwindled and sounds grew closer. Scott had turned his limitations into strengths, creating a game that worked within his technical constraints while delivering an experience that was genuinely frightening. The development of the first Five Nights at Freddy's game was relatively quick by game development standards, taking only a few months from concept to release. Scott worked alone, handling all aspects of development from programming to modeling to sound design. The models for the animatronics were created using 3D modeling software, given textures and details that made them look worn and uncanny. The restaurant setting was designed to feel familiar yet wrong, a children's entertainment venue that felt abandoned and corrupted, even though it was technically still operating. The phone calls from the previous security guard were recorded by Scott himself, speaking in a deliberately casual tone while describing horrifying situations, creating the darkly comic atmosphere that would become characteristic of the series. The original 4 animatronics each had distinct designs that made them memorable and gave them individual characteristics even with minimal animation. Freddy Fazbear was the face of the franchise, a brown bear with a top hat and bow tie, looking like a friendly mascot until you noticed the lifeless eyes and the way he moved with predatory intent. Bonnie the bunny was purple with a guitar, often the first animatronic to move and one of the most aggressive, creating early pressure on the player. Chica the chicken was yellow with a bib reading "Let's Eat," carrying a cupcake companion, and her approach was often signaled by sounds from the kitchen. Foxy the pirate fox was kept behind a curtain in Pirate Cove, and if not monitored carefully would sprint down the hallway for a devastating attack. Each character had personality through their movement patterns and behaviors, creating distinct threats that required different strategies to manage. The lore elements in the original game were subtle but effective, providing just enough information to create questions without giving clear answers. The newspaper clippings on the walls mentioned the missing children incident, referring to 5 children who had disappeared at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza years earlier. There were mentions of complaints about the animatronics smelling bad and leaking mysterious fluids, disgusting details that took on horrifying meaning when players theorized that the missing children's bodies might be hidden inside the suits. The phone messages mentioned previous night guards and the dangers they had faced, with one message cutting off suddenly with sounds of an attack, implying the fate of the person leaving the messages. These story elements were presented without explanation, leaving players to piece together what had happened and creating the mystery that would drive engagement with the series. The release strategy for Five Nights at Freddy's was simple but effective. Scott released the game on indie game platforms, pricing it affordably to make it accessible to a wide audience. He created a trailer that showcased the game's unique premise and terrifying moments, posting it online where it could be discovered and shared. The timing was fortunate because YouTube and streaming were at a point where horror game content was extremely popular, with viewers eager to watch their favorite creators react to scary games. When major YouTubers discovered Five Nights at Freddy's and began playing it, sharing their genuine terror with millions of subscribers, the game's popularity exploded beyond anything Scott could have anticipated. The viral nature of Five Nights at Freddy's content on YouTube created a feedback loop that propelled the game to massive success. As more creators played the game, more viewers discovered it, leading more creators to play it to capitalize on the trend, exposing it to even larger audiences. The game's design was perfect for this medium because rounds were relatively short, the scares were intense and generated strong reactions, and the mystery elements gave creators and viewers something to discuss and theorize about between scares. Watching someone else play Five Nights at Freddy's became almost more popular than playing it yourself, with reaction videos garnering millions of views as audiences enjoyed seeing others experience the terror they had felt or were too scared to experience themselves. The immediate success of Five Nights at Freddy's transformed Scott's life overnight. The game was earning significant revenue from sales across multiple platforms, and suddenly the developer who had been struggling to make ends meet found himself with a hit game and a passionate fanbase demanding more content. The pressure to capitalize on this success while it was hot led to Scott's decision to create a sequel, beginning the rapid release schedule that would characterize the franchise's early years. But Scott was not just motivated by financial success or the desire to milk a popular property. He genuinely cared about the story he had started and wanted to explore the dark mysteries he had introduced, to give answers while raising new questions, to build a larger mythology around Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and the tragedies that had occurred there. The first game had established the core horror and hinted at dark secrets, but it was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex story that Scott was beginning to envision. The success gave him the opportunity to expand his vision, to create not just a single game but an entire universe with interconnected stories spanning decades. The animatronics were not just robots. They were vessels for something far more tragic and terrifying. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was not just a fictional restaurant. It was a place where innocence had died and horror had taken root. And Scott Cawthon, the struggling developer who had faced rejection and harsh criticism, was about to become one of the most successful indie game developers in history by embracing the darkness and creating a horror franchise that would haunt millions. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 arrived with shocking speed, released in November 2014, just 3 months after the original game. A development pace that seemed impossible for a solo developer. The sequel expanded everything about the original while changing the formula enough to feel fresh rather than repetitive. Scott made the bold decision to set the second game as a prequel, taking place in 1987 at an earlier location of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This decision added complexity to the timeline from the very beginning, establishing that the franchise would not tell its story in chronological order, but would jump through time, revealing pieces of the larger puzzle out of sequence. This non-linear approach to storytelling would become a defining characteristic of the series, creating confusion but also encouraging deeper analysis as fans tried to arrange events in their proper order. The gameplay of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was significantly different from the original, addressing criticism that the first game was too simple while introducing new mechanics that increased the tension. The security office in this game had no doors, leaving the player completely vulnerable to attack. Instead, players had to rely on a Freddy Fazbear mask, a spare animatronic head that could be worn to fool the attacking robots into thinking the player was one of them. The mask mechanic created terrifying moments where animatronics would stand directly in front of the player, staring with dead eyes while the player sat frozen, hoping the disguise would hold. The game also introduced vents through which animatronics could crawl, requiring players to use lights to check the vents and wind up a music box to keep one particularly dangerous animatronic from attacking. The cast of animatronics expanded significantly in the second game, featuring both new versions and damaged versions of the original characters. The new animatronics, called toy versions, were sleeker and more modern-looking, designed with brighter colors and more child-friendly appearances. Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica resembled their original counterparts, but with updated designs. A new character called Mangle, a severely damaged animatronic that had been taken apart and put back together so many times by children that it had become a twisted mess of metal and wires, hung from the ceiling and created one of the most disturbing images in the series. The puppet, also called the marionette, was introduced as a mysterious animatronic kept in a music box who would attack if the music was allowed to stop, creating constant pressure on the player to manage the music box while dealing with all other threats. The original animatronics appeared in the second game as well, but in withered forms, severely damaged and kept in a parts and service room. Withered Freddy, Withered Bonnie, Withered Chica, and Withered Foxy were more frightening than their original versions, with exposed endoskeletons, missing parts, and more aggressive appearances. These withered versions suggested age and decay, implying that these were the actual animatronics from the original game's timeline, already old and damaged by 1987. The presence of both new and old animatronics in the same location raised questions about why the old ones were still there, why they had been deactivated but not destroyed, and what connection they had to the incidents that had plagued Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The lore expanded significantly with the second game, introducing the concept of the bite of 87, an incident mentioned in the phone calls where an animatronic had bitten someone and caused severe injury. The phone calls suggested this incident led to new restrictions on how the animatronics could operate during the day, no longer being allowed to roam freely around guests. The game setting just before this incident meant players were working at the location when or shortly before this tragedy would occur, adding ominous foreshadowing to the experience. The ending newspaper clippings revealed that the new location would be closing and that the toy animatronics would be scrapped, while the old animatronics would be kept in hopes of refurbishing them for a smaller, budget-conscious location, explaining the transition to the original game setting. The mini-games hidden throughout Five Nights at Freddy's 2 were crucial to understanding the deeper story, presenting cryptic, Atari-style gameplay sequences that revealed information about the past. These mini-games showed scenes from the perspective of different animatronics, depicting events that had occurred at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. One of the most important mini-games showed the puppet's origin, revealing a child locked outside a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location in the rain, crying while other children played inside. A purple car arrived, and the scene ended with the child collapsed outside, implying they had died. The puppet appeared and approached the child's body, and the screen went black, suggesting that the puppet had been possessed by this first victim, the child who had died before the others. Other mini-games in the second game showed the perspectives of the animatronics as they were given cake to children, innocent activities that suddenly turned dark when a man in a purple sprite, later understood to represent William Afton, appeared and murdered children. These scenes were disturbing in their simplicity, using basic graphics to depict horrifying acts. The minigames revealed that the murders had happened during the restaurant's operation, with children being lured away from safety and killed, their bodies presumably hidden in ways that prevented immediate discovery. The fact that these scenes were hidden, requiring players to die in specific ways or complete specific actions to unlock them, made them feel like secrets that were not meant to be found, forbidden knowledge about what had truly happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The introduction of Golden Freddy in the second game, appearing rarely and mysteriously, added another layer to the mythology. Golden Freddy was not a normal animatronic, but appeared as a ghostly, supernatural presence that could manifest in the office without warning. The character was colored yellow gold and seemed to exist outside the normal rules that governed the other animatronics. Looking at Golden Freddy for too long would cause the game to crash, a breaking of the fourth wall that suggested this character had power beyond the others. Theories immediately began circulating about who Golden Freddy represented and why this character was so different, with many fans believing it was connected to a fifth victim or had special significance in the overall story. The rapid success of the second game, which sold even better than the original and received enthusiastic reception from the community, confirmed that Five Nights at Freddy's was not a flash in the pan but a genuine phenomenon with staying power. Scott had proven he could deliver quality content quickly without sacrificing the elements that made the series special. The mystery deepened with each game, and fans were eager to analyze every detail, creating elaborate theories and timeline documents that attempted to piece together the full story. The community was growing rapidly, with fan artists, fan game developers, musicians, and content creators all producing Five Nights at Freddy's content that kept interest high between official releases. The success also brought challenges, particularly the pressure to continue delivering games at the pace fans now expected while maintaining quality and advancing the story. Scott was still a solo developer doing all the work himself, and the physical and mental toll of such rapid development was significant. But he was driven not just by commercial success but by genuine passion for the story he was telling and respect for the community that had embraced his work. He engaged with fans online, reading theories, occasionally dropping hints, and showing appreciation for the creative work fans produced. This relationship between creator and community was special, creating a sense that everyone was invested together in uncovering the truth about Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The second game also established patterns that would continue throughout the series, including the use of hidden screens, secret messages, and requiring specific actions to unlock the true ending or additional content. Players had to replay games multiple times, experimenting with different approaches to discover everything Scott had hidden. This design philosophy respected players' intelligence and rewarded thorough exploration, creating a sense that there were always more secrets to find. The games were relatively short in terms of main gameplay but could be played for dozens of hours by players determined to find every Easter egg and unlock every secret, providing excellent value and encouraging the kind of deep engagement that built passionate fanbases. The storytelling technique of revealing information through environmental details, newspaper clippings, phone messages, and hidden minigames rather than explicit narrative exposition became a hallmark of Five Nights at Freddy's. Scott trusted players to piece together the story themselves, providing evidence and clues rather than straightforward explanations. This approach made players feel smart when they made connections and discovered new information, and it created endless material for discussion and debate within the community. The ambiguity was frustrating to some players who wanted clear answers, but it was also precisely what kept people engaged, theorizing and discussing the games long after completing them. The mystery was the content, and by maintaining that mystery while gradually revealing more pieces of the puzzle, Scott kept the franchise vital and compelling. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 marked a significant shift in the franchise's direction, jumping forward 30 years from the previous games to a future where Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had become a distant memory and the subject of a horror attraction. The game was released in March 2015, continuing the rapid release schedule that had become characteristic of the series. The setting of Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, was a brilliant concept that allowed Scott to explore the legacy of the events depicted in previous games while introducing a new and terrifying main antagonist. The attraction had been created by people who wanted to capitalize on the dark history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, collecting authentic props and artifacts from the defunct restaurants to create a haunted house experience based on real tragedies. The gameplay of the third game refined the formula again, this time placing the player in a security office with a more complex system of cameras, audio devices, and ventilation. The main threat was no longer a group of animatronics but a single, relentless enemy called Springtrap, a severely damaged animatronic suit that stalked through the attraction with clear intent to harm the player. Springtrap's design was disturbing, showing years of decay and damage with parts of the suit torn away to reveal the machinery underneath and something else, something that looked like organic matter, the corpse of a person who had died inside the suit. The revelation that Springtrap contained a human corpse elevated the horror from supernatural to viscerally physical. The idea of someone trapped and dying inside a mechanical suit was nightmare fuel that added a new dimension to the franchise's horror. The identity of the corpse inside Springtrap was one of the most important revelations in the entire franchise, finally giving players a face to put to the evil that had caused all the suffering. Through the hidden minigames in the third game, the story of William Afton's final fate was revealed. The minigames showed the spirits of the murdered children confronting a man in a Spring Bonnie suit, the yellow rabbit animatronic that Afton had worn when luring and killing his victims. Cornered by the ghosts of his victims in the safe room of a defunct restaurant, Afton made a desperate decision to hide inside the Spring Bonnie suit, believing the spirits could not harm him while he was inside it. But the spring lock mechanisms, already old and unstable, were triggered by moisture from the leaking roof and Afton's own movements. The spring lock failure was depicted in brutal detail through the minigames, showing the mechanism snapping closed and impaling the man inside with metal rods and mechanical parts. William Afton's death inside the Spring Bonnie suit was agonizing, a slow process of being crushed and pierced by the very technology he had created. The irony was perfect. The killer who had used animatronic suits to hide the bodies of his victims was himself killed and hidden inside such a suit. But death was not the end for William Afton. Something kept him conscious inside the suit, some force or his own refusal to die, and over the years the suit and the corpse inside it decayed together, creating Springtrap, a fusion of man and machine animated by hatred and evil that refused to end even after death. The mini-games in the third game provided crucial backstory about the spring lock suits and the early days of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Players saw scenes of employees wearing Spring Bonnie and Spring Freddy suits, performing for children at the restaurants. But they also saw warnings about the suits being dangerous, mentions of multiple simultaneous spring lock failures, and evidence that these hybrid animatronic costume suits had killed people before William Afton's death. The spring-lock suits represented the ambition and recklessness of the early Fazbear Entertainment, creating technology that was impressive but fundamentally unsafe, prioritizing innovation and profit over the safety of employees and potentially customers. The suits became a symbol of everything wrong with the company, dangerous products that should never have been created, continuing to cause harm long after they were officially retired. The third game's ending was significant because it appeared to offer closure, suggesting that the horror might finally be ending. After surviving the nights and dealing with Springtrap, the attraction burned down, with the final scene showing the building engulfed in flames. The newspaper clippings suggested that much of the collected memorabilia and artifacts had been destroyed in the fire, with only some items being sold at auction. The implication seemed to be that Springtrap had been destroyed in the fire, that William Afton's evil had finally been ended by burning. But an image after the final newspaper showed glowing eyes in darkness, suggesting that something had survived the fire, that perhaps Springtrap had escaped or that some part of William Afton refused to die even when burned. This ambiguous ending left the door open for continuation while providing enough closure that the series could have ended here if Scott had chosen to stop. The hidden minigames in the third game also showed what appeared to be the spirits of the children being freed from the animatronic suits. In one of the most important secret scenes, accessed through completing specific actions, the player saw the spirits of the children gathering, and the heads of the animatronics lit up before going dark, suggesting the children were finally released from their prisons. The puppet appeared in these scenes as well, seemingly facilitating the release of the spirits, fulfilling the role of protector even in death. These scenes provided emotional catharsis, suggesting that the murdered children could finally find peace, that their long nightmare of being trapped in animatronic suits, seeking revenge or trying to communicate their suffering had ended. The tragedy of their deaths remained, but at least their spirits could rest. The revelation of William Afton as the killer and the exploration of his fate transformed the narrative from a mystery about what happened into a more complete story about consequences and justice. Afton was not just a generic villain but a specific person whose actions had destroyed multiple lives, including his own family. His obsession with life and death, his willingness to murder children in pursuit of his goals, and his ultimate fate of being trapped in the very technology he had misused created a narrative arc that was satisfying in its dark justice. The fact that he could not truly die, that he persisted as Springtrap continuing to threaten people decades after his death, suggested that some evil is too great to be easily eliminated, that the consequences of terrible actions continue to ripple forward long after the original act. The third game also developed the character of Phone Dude, a more casual and less professional version of the phone guy from previous games. Phone Dude worked at Fazbear's Fright and left messages for the player about the attraction's development, discussing finding Springtrap and bringing it to the location. The contrast between Phone Dude's enthusiastic excitement about finding an authentic animatronic and the player's knowledge of what Springtrap actually was created dramatic irony. Phone Dude had no idea he had brought a murder victim containing the corpse of a serial killer into the attraction, treating it as a cool find rather than the dangerous threat it represented. This ignorance mirrored the broader theme of people in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe repeatedly underestimating the danger of the animatronics and the darkness associated with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The community response to the third game was enthusiastic, with fans appreciating both the gameplay evolution and the significant lore revelations. The confirmation of William Afton as the killer gave theorists a central figure to focus on, allowing them to revisit previous games and look for evidence of his presence and influence. The revelation about spring-lock suits explained details from previous games that had been confusing, providing context for certain designs and references. The apparent conclusion of the story, with the spirits freed and Springtrap burned, provided satisfaction while the hints of continuation kept hope alive for fans who wanted more. The third game felt like a potential ending point, but it also laid groundwork for how the story could continue if Scott chose to explore what happened next. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 represented a dramatic shift in both gameplay and storytelling, taking the franchise into deeply psychological territory and exploring the perspective of a child terrorized by the animatronics. Released in July 2015, the fourth game was initially presented as the final chapter in the series, the conclusion of the story that Scott had been building. The game abandoned the security office setting entirely, instead placing the player in a child's bedroom defending against nightmare versions of the animatronics that stalked through a dark house. The perspective shift from an adult security guard to a vulnerable child changed the tone significantly, making the horror more personal and primal, tapping into childhood fears of monsters in the dark and things hiding under the bed or in the closet. The gameplay of the fourth game relied heavily on sound design and precise timing, requiring players to listen carefully for breathing, footsteps, and other audio cues to determine which door or area to check and defend. The nightmare animatronics were grotesque versions of the familiar characters, twisted into more monstrous forms with sharp teeth, claw-like hands, and more aggressive designs. Nightmare Freddy appeared with smaller versions of himself called frettles that would accumulate on the bed, requiring the player to shine a light on them to make them disappear. Nightmare Bonnie and Nightmare Chica approached from different sides of the room, requiring the player to quickly move between doors, listening for breathing to know when to close the door versus when it was safe to check the hallway. Nightmare Foxy appeared in the closet, requiring periodic checks with the flashlight to keep him at bay. And on later nights, Nightmare Fredbear and the Completely Black Nightmare appeared as ultimate threats that combined patterns from multiple animatronics. The story of the fourth game was told through a series of minigames that played between nights, showing events from the life of a child in 1983. These minigames were heartbreaking, depicting a young boy who was terrified of the animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, crying and resisting when his family tried to take him there. The boy was tormented by his older brother, who wore a foxy mask and jumped out to scare him with friends who wore masks of the other animatronics. The child's fears were dismissed by his family, treated as irrational rather than legitimate concerns. The minigames showed the child's room filled with plushies of the animatronics, and a mysterious golden Fredbear plush that seemed to speak to the child, offering comfort and cryptic statements about him being broken. The tragedy depicted in the fourth game's minigames culminated in one of the most disturbing scenes in the franchise. The child's older brother and his friends decided to play a cruel prank during the child's birthday party at Fredbear's Family Diner, an early location featuring Spring Bonnie and Fredbear. Despite the child's tears and resistance, the brother and his friends picked up the crying child and carried him toward the stage where a Springlock Fredbear animatronic was performing. The child begged and pleaded as they lifted him up and placed his head inside Fredbear's mouth as a joke, trying to scare him by making him give Fredbear a kiss. But something went wrong. The animatronic's jaws closed on the child's head with a sickening crunch shown through pixelated graphics, and the screen faded to black with the sound of the child's tears and the brother's screams. The aftermath of the bite was shown through hospital scenes where the child lay dying, with the Fredbear plush and other plushies appearing to watch over him. The famous line, "I will put you back together," appeared, spoken by an unknown voice, suggesting that someone or something would try to save the child or give him some form of continued existence. The final minigame showed the child's room with the plushies and flowers fading away, the sound of a flatline, and everything going dark, implying the child had died from his injuries. The tragedy was made worse by the context that this was caused by a cruel prank by the child's own brother, that the child who had been most afraid of the animatronics had been killed by one in the most horrific way possible. The interpretation of the fourth game became one of the most debated topics in the entire franchise. Were the nightmare animatronics actual threats, or were they hallucinations experienced by the dying child? Was the gameplay section taking place in a real bedroom or in the child's mind as he lay in a coma? Some fans believed the entire game was the child's dying nightmare, his fears given form as he slipped away. Others believed the nightmares were experienced by the older brother years later, tormented by guilt over causing his brother's death. The presence of medical equipment sounds in the background of the gameplay, pills and flowers visible in the room, and the overall atmosphere suggested connections to trauma, guilt, and possibly medication-induced hallucinations. The introduction of Fredbear's Family Diner as a location distinct from and earlier than Freddy Fazbear's Pizza added another layer to the timeline and mythology. The presence of only two animatronics, Spring Bonnie and Fredbear, both using the dangerous spring lock suit technology, suggested this was the very first location, the origin point of the entire franchise. The bite shown in the fourth game was clearly not the bite of 87 mentioned in the second game, but a different incident occurring in 1983. This meant there had been multiple bite incidents, multiple tragedies involving the animatronics harming people, and the companies kept reopening and creating new locations despite this pattern of danger and death. The revelation of multiple bites added to the sense that Fazbear Entertainment was criminally negligent, continuing operations even after multiple incidents that should have shut them down permanently. The identity of the crying child and the brother became subjects of intense speculation. Many fans theorized that the crying child was somehow connected to Golden Freddy, that his death and the promise to put him back together resulted in his spirit possessing that mysterious animatronic. The older brother was theorized by many to be Michael Afton, the character who would be revealed in later games as William Afton's son. If this theory was correct, it added layers of tragedy to the Afton family story, suggesting that Michael had killed his own younger brother accidentally through a cruel prank, and that this guilt had shaped his entire life, driving him to try to undo his father's evil and perhaps atone for his own terrible mistake. The fourth game's ending featured a box, a locked chest shown with the text, "Perhaps some things are best left forgotten for now," suggesting there were secrets Scott was not yet ready to reveal. The box became legendary in the community, with fans spending years speculating about what it contained and what information was still being withheld. Scott later stated in interviews that the box was intended to contain the pieces needed to solve the complete story, but that the community's interpretation of events had diverged from his original intent, making him reconsider what he wanted to reveal and how. The box remained locked, a symbol of the unknowable mysteries that still existed within the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. The fourth game was emotionally heavier than previous entries, focusing less on mystery and more on tragedy. The death of an innocent child, killed accidentally by his own brother during a birthday celebration that should have been happy, was heartbreaking. The psychological horror of the nightmare sequences, representing either dying hallucinations or trauma-induced nightmares, was deeply unsettling in a different way than the previous game's more straightforward survival horror. The fourth game showed that the franchise could explore different types of horror and emotion, that it was not limited to jump scares and mysteries, but could create genuinely sad and disturbing narratives about damaged people and broken families. The announcement that the fourth game was intended to be the final chapter felt appropriate given the emotional weight of its ending, but it also felt incomplete. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many threads were left dangling, and the community was not ready to let go of the franchise they had become so invested in. Scott had created a universe that had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond his initial vision into something that fans felt belonged to them as much as to him. The pressure to continue, combined with Scott's own continued interest in exploring the story, meant that the retirement of the franchise would be short-lived. New games were already being conceived, new angles on the story were being developed, and the nightmare was far from over. Five Nights at Freddy's sister location represented a major evolution in both production value and storytelling complexity, moving beyond the minimalist presentation of previous games to create a more cinematic and narrative-focused experience. Released in October 2016 after more than a year of development, Sister Location had professional voice acting, more complex environments, and a story that was directly told through character dialogue and cutscenes in addition to the environmental storytelling and hidden lore that characterized previous entries. The game took place in a completely new location, Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, an underground facility where advanced animatronics were stored and sent out for private parties. The shift from the familiar pizza restaurant setting to this strange underground facility created an atmosphere of wrongness from the beginning, making it clear that this place served purposes beyond simple entertainment. The animatronics of Sister Location were distinctly different from previous characters, more sophisticated and human-like in their design and movement. Circus Baby was the main animatronic, designed to look like a clown girl with elaborate mechanisms hidden inside her body. Ballora was a graceful ballerina animatronic accompanied by smaller puppet-like mini-arenas. Funtime Freddy was a white version of Freddy with a hand puppet named Bonbon. Funtime Foxy was a performer animatronic with a showman personality. These animatronics were not restaurant mascots but specialized entertainment robots that could be rented for events, and they were designed with disturbing hidden features that served sinister purposes. The game's story would reveal that these animatronics were specifically designed by William Afton to kidnap and kill children, with compartments inside them designed to capture and hide victims. The player character in Sister Location was revealed to be Michael Afton, William Afton's son. though this revelation came only at the end of the game. Michael had taken a job as a technician at Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, supposedly following his father's instructions but actually pursuing his own agenda. The game's voice acting included Circus Baby speaking to Michael throughout the nights, giving him instructions and guidance while slowly revealing information about what had happened in the facility and what she truly wanted. The voice performance for Circus Baby was crucial in creating her character, making her seem both helpful and deeply unsettling. A machine that spoke with the voice and mannerisms of a child, but discussed horrifying topics with disturbing casualness. The gameplay of Sister Location varied significantly between nights, with each night presenting different objectives and mechanics, rather than repeating the same survival formula. Some nights required the player to hide and avoid animatronics, others required completing maintenance tasks under time pressure, and some involved tense sequences of following audio cues or navigating through dark spaces. This variety made the game feel more like a narrative adventure with horror elements rather than a pure survival horror experience. The different gameplay approaches kept the experience fresh but also meant the game was less mechanically focused than previous entries, prioritizing story delivery over gameplay challenge. The revelation about Circus Baby's origin was one of the most tragic elements in the entire franchise. Through hidden scenes and dialogue, players learned that Circus Baby had killed a child during her first and only activation at a birthday party. The child was William Afton's own daughter, Elizabeth, who had been fascinated by Circus Baby despite her father's warnings to stay away from the animatronic. During the party, when Elizabeth was alone with Circus Baby, the animatronic's hidden capture mechanism activated, pulling Elizabeth inside where she was killed. Elizabeth's spirit possessed Circus Baby, and she had been trapped inside the animatronic ever since. The tragedy was compounded by the irony that William Afton, who had designed animatronics to murder children, had his own daughter killed by one of his creations, a dark justice that paralleled his own eventual death inside a springlock suit. The other animatronics in the facility also had disturbing backstories suggested through environmental details and dialogue. The Funtime animatronics were implied to have been used for kidnapping and possibly murder, with their internal schematics showing the hidden compartments and disturbing design features that suggested their true purpose. The facility itself was revealed to be a cover for William Afton's experiments with Remnant, the mysterious supernatural substance that allowed spirits to possess animatronics. The underground location made sense as a place where illegal and immoral activities could be conducted away from public view, explaining why this facility was so different from the public-facing restaurants. The ending of Sister Location was shocking and disturbing, revealing the true nature of what had been happening throughout the game. Circus Baby and the other animatronics had been manipulating Michael, leading him through the facility with the ultimate goal of using him to escape. In the final night, the animatronics revealed their plan. They had combined themselves into a single amalgamation called Ennard, shedding their outer shells to create a tangled mass of metal and wires. Ennard used a scooping machine, a device designed to remove the endoskeletons from animatronics on Michael. The scooper removed Michael's internal organs, and Ennard climbed inside his body, wearing him like a suit to escape the facility. The post-game cutscenes showed the aftermath of this horrifying plan, depicting Michael's body decaying over time as Ennard used it to walk around the surface world. Michael's skin turned purple and rotted, his body becoming a corpse that somehow continued to function. Eventually, Ennard exited Michael's body through his mouth in a disturbing scene, leaving him collapsed in the street. But impossibly, Michael stood back up, his empty body animated by something unknown, and spoke directly to the audience. He revealed his name, Michael Afton, and explained that he had been following his father's instructions but now understood what he had to do. He vowed to find William, stating that he was going to come find him. This ending transformed Michael from a simple player character into a tragic figure, a man who had been killed and hollowed out but refused to die, driven by a need to confront his father and end the horror he had created. The lore implications of Sister Location were massive, providing crucial context for the entire franchise. The game confirmed that William Afton was not just a murderer but a scientist of sorts, someone conducting experiments with death and consciousness, trying to understand how spirits could persist and be manipulated through technology. The concept of remnant was introduced as a supernatural element that could be harvested and used, explaining how the possession of animatronics functioned and why William might have been killing children in the first place. The revelation that Michael Afton had been the protagonist of previous games, or at least some of them, recontextualized earlier experiences and suggested that the story of the games was Michael's journey to understand and stop his father's evil. The relationship between the Afton family members became clearer and more tragic with sister location. William Afton had a daughter Elizabeth who died because of his own creation. He had a son Michael who became a walking corpse on a mission to stop him. He had another son, the crying child from the fourth game, who had been killed in an accident at one of the early locations. William's family had been destroyed by his obsessions and his actions, leaving only broken, damaged survivors or spirits trapped in machines. The family tragedy elevated the franchise's story from a simple horror mystery to a multi-generational saga about how evil choices destroy not just victims but the families of those who commit evil. The voice acting and production quality of Sister Location showed how far the franchise had come from its humble origins as a solo indie project. Scott had begun working with professional voice actors and had invested significant resources into making the game more polished and ambitious. The success of the franchise had given him the budget to expand his vision, and he used those resources to create a game that felt more expensive and professionally produced, while maintaining the core elements that made Five Nights at Freddy's special. The evolution from simple indie horror to a major franchise with significant production values was evident in Sister Location, marking a transition point where Five Nights at Freddy's became unmistakably a major player in the gaming industry rather than just a successful indie darling. Sister Location also introduced the custom night mode, a feature that would become standard in later games, allowing players to customize the difficulty and behavior of animatronics to create their own challenges. This mode extended the game's replay value significantly and allowed players to test their skills against increasingly difficult scenarios. The highest difficulty challenges became legendary within the community, with completion of nights with all animatronics set to maximum becoming a badge of honor among skilled players. This addition showed Scott's understanding that different players wanted different experiences, with some focused on story and others focused on gameplay challenge, and his willingness to provide content for both audiences. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, released in December 2017, was one of Scott Cawthon's most clever and ambitious games, hiding its true nature behind an innocent facade and building to an emotionally powerful conclusion that seemed to finally bring closure to the decades-long horror story. The game was initially presented as exactly what the title suggested, a business management simulator where players could design and run their own Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. Players could choose decorations, attractions, and animatronics to create a restaurant that would attract customers and generate revenue. The gameplay was surprisingly engaging as a management sim, with players balancing finances, dealing with lawsuits, and trying to create a successful family restaurant. Many players initially believed Scott had genuinely released a light-hearted management game, a departure from the horror that defined the series. But this being a Five Nights at Freddy's game, the truth was darker. Each day, after managing the restaurant, players could choose to explore the alleyway behind the building where they might find salvageable items and equipment that could be brought into the restaurant to save money. Sometimes what players found was not equipment but animatronics, damaged and dangerous characters that could be salvaged for profit despite the obvious risk. The salvage sequences were tense horror experiences where players had to sit across from a damaged animatronic, testing it with audio cues while it occasionally lunged at them, requiring split-second reactions to avoid a jump scare. These sequences revealed the game's true nature as a continuation of the horror franchise, and the animatronics being salvaged were some of the most important characters in the entire lore. The animatronics that could be salvaged were Molten Freddy, an amalgamation formed from the remains of the Funtime animatronics and entered after Circus Baby had been ejected from the combined entity. Scrap Baby was Circus Baby herself, rebuilt from scrap parts after being separated from Ennard, still containing the spirit of Elizabeth Afton. Scrap Trap was William Afton, having survived the fire at the end of the third game and rebuilt himself using damaged Springtrap parts, continuing to persist despite everything. And Lefty, a black bear animatronic that seemed less aggressive than the others but contained a crucial secret. The puppet, Charlotte Emily, was trapped inside Lefty, having been captured specifically to bring her to this location. By salvaging these animatronics, Players were unknowingly gathering all the most important possessed animatronics into one place, setting the stage for a final confrontation. After enough days of running the restaurant and potentially salvaging the animatronics, players would experience a different ending, a finale that revealed the true purpose of the entire restaurant. The completion certificate screen transitioned into a monologue from Henry Emily, William Afton's former business partner and the father of Charlotte, speaking to everyone trapped in the building. Henry revealed that the entire restaurant had been a trap, a carefully constructed plan to lure all of the possessed animatronics into one location for a specific purpose: to end it all. The building was designed to burn, with Henry explaining that he had a way out prepared for those who deserved it, but that those responsible for the pain and suffering would face a different fate. Henry's speech was one of the most powerful and emotional moments in the franchise, addressing each character individually with knowledge of who they were and what they had endured. He spoke to his daughter Charlotte, apologizing that this was how it had to end but assuring her that she would finally be free from the burden of protecting others. He spoke to Elizabeth, trapped inside Scrap Baby, acknowledging that she had been used by her father and offering her release from her prison. He spoke to the spirits of the original missing children, now residing in Molten Freddy, thanking them for their patience and promising them peace. And he spoke to William Afton, his former friend turned monster, condemning him to the darkest pit of hell and assuring him that this time there would be no escape, that the fire would end him once and for all. The fire sequence showed the restaurant burning with everyone inside, the screen gradually filling with flames and smoke as Henry's speech concluded. The achievement named Completion Ending suggested this was meant to be a true conclusion, a finale where the loose ends were tied up and the spirits could finally rest. The fire represented purification, destroying the animatronics and the building itself, releasing the trapped souls and ensuring that William Afton's evil could not continue. Henry's sacrifice, staying in the building to ensure the plan succeeded even though it meant his own death, was portrayed as a heroic act, a father finally able to give his daughter peace and end the nightmare that he felt partially responsible for creating. The themes of responsibility, redemption, and sacrifice in Pizzeria Simulator elevated it beyond a simple horror game into something more profound. Henry Emily had spent decades knowing that his business partner had murdered children and that his own daughter was trapped trying to protect others. The guilt and grief had driven him to create this elaborate plan, to design a trap that would end the suffering once and for all. His speech suggested that he blamed himself for not acting sooner, for not preventing William's crimes when he might have had the chance. The fire was not just about stopping William Afton but about Henry taking responsibility for the harm that had come from their business and their creations, accepting his own death as part of the price for ending the horror. The game's dual nature as both management simulator and horror experience was thematically appropriate, representing the surface versus the truth of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. On the surface, it was a family restaurant where children celebrated birthdays and parents bought pizza. Beneath that surface were tragedies, murdered children, possessed animatronics, and a legacy of pain that refused to end. The gameplay reflected this duality, with cheerful restaurant management during the day and horror lurking in the shadows, ready to emerge when defenses were lowered. The meta-commentary on Fazbear Entertainment's repeated attempts to rebrand and distance itself from past tragedies, while continuing to use the same animatronics and concepts, was evident throughout, critiquing the company's prioritization of profit over safety and responsibility. The lore revealed through rare screens and hidden content in Pizzeria Simulator filled in more gaps about the timeline and the company's history. Players learned about the cover-ups, the legal maneuvering, and the corporate decisions that allowed Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to continue operating despite multiple incidents. The game portrayed Fazbear Entertainment as a company that would do anything to protect its brand and profits, dismissing the previous games as fiction created by a rogue developer, using manipulative legal language to avoid responsibility, and prioritizing image management over acknowledging their role in real tragedies. The satire was sharp, holding up the fictional company as an example of corporate negligence and the prioritization of profit over human welfare. The peaceful ending suggested by Pizzeria Simulator, with all of the spirits freed and William Afton destroyed in the fire, provided emotional catharsis for players who had followed the story through multiple games. The idea that the children could finally move on, that Charlotte could rest after her long vigil, and that Elizabeth could be freed from her father's curse was deeply satisfying. The assurance that William Afton would face appropriate punishment, condemned to the darkest pit of hell, provided justice for all of his crimes. The ending felt earned, the culmination of a long and complex story that had begun with a simple horror game about animatronics moving at night and had evolved into a multi-generational tragedy about the consequences of evil and the possibility of redemption and release. But even as Pizzeria Simulator provided closure, hints suggested the story might not be truly over. The use of the word closure, rather than end, the knowledge that William Afton had survived fire before, and the success of the franchise all suggested that more content might come. The community was divided between those who appreciated the definitive ending and wanted the story to rest, and those who were eager for more content and wanted to explore what might come next. Scott Cawthon had created a universe rich enough to support countless more stories, and the commercial success of the franchise made continuation almost inevitable. But Pizzeria Simulator remained a high point, a game that had successfully balanced horror, emotion, and narrative closure in a way that satisfied fans while respecting the story that had been built over years. The impact of Pizzeria Simulator extended beyond its gameplay and story to influence how players thought about the franchise as a whole. The revelation that all of the suffering could have been ended sooner if someone had taken action raised questions about responsibility and complicity. Henry's guilt suggested that inaction in the face of evil was itself a form of wrongdoing, that knowing about harm and failing to stop it made one partially responsible for its continuation. These moral questions added depth to the franchise, encouraging players to think about real-world parallels and their own responsibilities when witnessing injustice or harm. The game transcended its horror entertainment origins to make statements about ethics, responsibility, and the cost of confronting evil. Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted marked a new era for the franchise, being the first entry developed primarily by an external studio, Steelwool Studios, with Scott Cawthon overseeing as creative director and story consultant. Released in May 2019, Help Wanted was a virtual reality experience that brought players into the world of Five Nights at Freddy's in an unprecedented way. The game featured recreated experiences from previous entries optimized for VR, allowing players to stand in the security office, reach out to close doors, hold a flashlight, and experience the terror of animatronics approaching in three-dimensional space. The immersion of VR transformed the franchise's horror, making it more visceral and immediate than ever before. Players who had never found the original games particularly scary often found the VR versions genuinely terrifying, with the sense of presence and scale making the animatronics feel like real physical threats. Beyond the recreated experiences, Help Wanted introduced a brilliant meta-narrative that acknowledged the previous games while taking the story in an unexpected direction. The framing story revealed that a game development company hired by Fazbear Entertainment had created the VR experience as part of a campaign to rehabilitate the company's image. The in-universe explanation was that a rogue developer had created games spreading lies about Fazbear Entertainment, and the VR experience was meant to dismiss those claims as fiction while showing that the company had nothing to hide. This meta-commentary played with the relationship between the games as entertainment products and the fictional universe they depicted, blurring the line between reality and fiction in a way that added layers to the lore. The true horror of Help Wanted emerged through the game's hidden story about Glitchtrap, a digital entity that appeared as a character in a Spring Bonnie costume but was revealed to be something far more sinister. Through playing the VR game, the player character, a beta tester named Vanessa, became exposed to this entity. Glitchtrap was heavily implied to be William Afton in some form, his consciousness having been scanned into the digital realm from circuit boards recovered from the burned Pizzeria Simulator location. Rather than dying in the fire as Henry intended, some part of William Afton had survived by transferring into technology, becoming a computer virus or digital ghost that could infect and corrupt people through exposure to the VR game. The concept of William Afton surviving as a digital entity was both brilliant and terrifying, showing that the franchise could evolve beyond its original setting and rules. Afton was no longer limited to physical form or even the supernatural possession of animatronics. He had become information, code, something that could replicate and spread through technology. This evolution made sense in the modern era, reflecting contemporary fears about technology, hacking, and digital corruption. It also ensured that William Afton could continue as the franchise's primary antagonist indefinitely, as digital entities could theoretically never be truly destroyed as long as copies existed somewhere in the vast network of connected devices. Glitchtrap's corruption of Vanessa was shown through the game's darker levels and hidden tapes that revealed her story. Vanessa, initially a normal person testing the game, became increasingly influenced by Glitchtrap's presence. The entity manipulated her, spoke to her, and gradually took control of aspects of her behavior. By the game's end, it was suggested that Vanessa had become Glitchtrap's follower or vessel, transformed into someone who would carry out his will in the physical world. This possession or corruption created a new type of threat, a human antagonist under the influence of William Afton's digital ghost, bridging the gap between the supernatural horror of the original games and the technological horror of the modern era. The gameplay variety in Help Wanted was impressive, featuring not just survival horror but also repair tasks, entertainment performances, and prize counter games, all presented in VR. Players could work on animatronics, reaching into their mechanisms to replace parts while they occasionally lunged forward. Players could perform as Freddy on stage, playing music and entertaining a virtual audience. These varied experiences showed different aspects of what it might be like to work at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza beyond just surviving night shifts. The VR format made these tasks feel more real and immediate, with the tactile nature of reaching out and manipulating objects creating a stronger sense of presence than traditional controller-based gameplay. The graphics and presentation of Help Wanted were a significant upgrade from previous entries, taking advantage of modern hardware and the VR format to create the most visually impressive Five Nights at Freddy's experience to date. The animatronics were modeled in high detail, showing textures, wear, and mechanical parts that made them feel more real and substantial. The environments were fully three-dimensional explorable spaces rather than pre-rendered images, allowing players to look around and examine details. The sound design was spatial, using VR audio to create directional sounds that players had to locate and identify. The technical improvements showed how far the franchise had come from its minimalist origins while maintaining the core atmosphere and horror that defined the series. The introduction of Glitchtrap and the digital horror angle opened new storytelling possibilities that subsequent games and content would explore. The idea that Fazbear Entertainment would continue trying to profit from their dark history, creating VR games and other products based on real tragedies, added cynical commentary on corporate behavior and exploitation. The suggestion that these attempts to capitalize on the past could literally resurrect evil through recovered technology was a fitting consequence for the company's persistent negligence and greed. The meta-narrative about games and reality, about how stories affect people, and how digital media could serve as a vector for influence and corruption, added philosophical depth to the horror. The community response to Help Wanted was enthusiastic, with VR players praising the immersion and non-VR players appreciating the lore developments and the game's role in continuing the story beyond Pizzeria Simulator's apparent conclusion. The game proved that Five Nights at Freddy's could successfully transition to new technologies and new development teams while maintaining its identity. The involvement of Steelwool Studios brought new technical expertise, while Scott's continued creative oversight ensured that the story and characters remained consistent with the established universe. This collaboration model would continue for future major releases, with Scott gradually stepping back from hands-on development while maintaining creative control over the franchise's direction. Help Wanted also featured numerous Easter eggs and hidden secrets that connected to previous games and hinted at future developments. The appearance of characters like Glitchtrap in hidden areas, the tapes that told Vanessa's story, and the multiple endings that showed different outcomes of the player's interaction with Glitchtrap all provided material for theorists to analyze. The game maintained the franchise's tradition of hiding important lore details in secret content that required extensive exploration and experimentation to discover. The community worked together to find every hidden element, documenting discoveries and building theories about what Help Wanted meant for the franchise's future direction. The technological evolution represented by Help Wanted reflected broader changes in gaming and entertainment, with VR becoming more accessible and developers exploring how established franchises could utilize the technology. Five Nights at Freddy's was particularly well-suited to VR because its horror relied on atmosphere and presence rather than complex mechanics, and the confined spaces and observation-based gameplay translated naturally to the VR format. The success of Help Wanted in VR helped demonstrate the technology's potential for horror games and encouraged other developers to explore similar adaptations of existing properties. The darker implications of Help Wanted's story, particularly around Vanessa's corruption and transformation into a follower or vessel for Glitchtrap, set up storylines that would be explored in future games. The idea that William Afton's influence could extend beyond his physical death to corrupt living people in the present day was deeply unsettling and suggested that his evil was not limited to past tragedies but could continue creating new victims. Vanessa's story added a human element to the modern era of the franchise. A person whose life had been destroyed by exposure to the cursed history of Fazbear Entertainment. Her transformation from innocent beta tester to something darker mirrored the broader theme of corruption and the destruction of innocence that ran throughout the franchise. Five Nights at Freddy's. Security Breach represented the most ambitious and expansive game in the franchise's history, finally releasing in December 2021 after multiple delays and extensive development. The game was a dramatic departure from previous entries in almost every way, featuring full free-roam exploration through a massive environment, a focus on running and hiding rather than static survival, and a more accessible presentation that aimed to bring the franchise to a wider audience. Security Breach took place in the Mega Pizzaplex, an enormous entertainment complex that combined elements of a shopping mall, theme park, and entertainment venue, representing the ultimate evolution of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza into a modern megacorporation. The Pizzaplex featured multiple levels, themed areas based on different animatronics, attractions, shops, and service areas, creating a massive explorable environment unlike anything in previous games. The protagonist of Security Breach was Gregory, a young boy who found himself trapped in the Pizzaplex after hours, forced to survive until morning while being hunted by security and animatronics. The shift to a child protagonist visible in cutscenes and voiced throughout the game created a different emotional dynamic than previous entries, where the player character was typically an unseen adult. Gregory was vulnerable, small in a massive environment built for entertainment but turned hostile. The game's tone was less overtly horrifying than previous entries, with brighter environments and a more adventure game feel, though dangerous situations and frightening moments still occurred throughout. This tonal shift made the game more accessible to younger players while attempting to maintain enough horror elements to satisfy longtime fans, a difficult balance that the game struggled to achieve perfectly. The most significant change in Security Breach was the presence of Glamrock Freddy, an animatronic who helped and protected Gregory rather than hunting him. Freddy served as a safe haven, with Gregory able to hide inside his chest compartment to avoid other threats. Freddy also provided guidance, assistance, and emotional support throughout the night, creating a partnership between the child and the animatronic. This relationship was heartwarming and added emotional stakes to the story, with Freddy explicitly caring about Gregory's safety and expressing concern about the situation they found themselves in. The dynamic between Gregory and Glamrock Freddy became the emotional core of the game, providing warmth and hope in contrast to the hostile environment and threats surrounding them. The antagonists in Security Breach included Roxanne Wolf, Montgomery Gator, and Glamrock Chica, animatronics who had been corrupted and were hunting Gregory through the Pizzaplex. Each had distinct personalities and characteristics, with Roxanne being focused on appearance and popularity, Montgomery being aggressive and destructive, and Glamrock Chica being obsessed with food and entertaining. The game featured sequences where Gregory had to destroy or incapacitate these animatronics to progress, taking their upgrades to improve Glamrock Freddy's capabilities. These sequences were morally complex because the animatronics were portrayed as victims of corruption rather than purely evil, making their destruction feel necessary but tragic. Vanessa appeared as a security guard hunting Gregory through the Pizzaplex, continuing her story from Help Wanted as someone corrupted by Glitchtrap. The game also introduced Vanny, a character in a rabbit costume who appeared to be Vanessa under Glitchtrap's influence, serving as a more overtly threatening presence. The relationship between Vanessa and Vanny, whether they were the same person at different times or somehow separate entities, was deliberately ambiguous. Vanny's appearances were among the most traditionally horrifying moments in the game, with her erratic movements and threatening behavior creating tension and fear. The subplot about Vanessa's corruption and Gregory's attempts to help her added depth to the story, exploring themes of mind control, identity, and whether people could be saved from digital corruption. The revelation that the Pizzaplex had been built on top of the ruins of previous locations created literal layers of history, with the modern entertainment complex sitting above burned remains of Pizzeria Simulator and potentially other earlier locations. Gregory and Glamrock Freddy could descend into these ruins, exploring the charred remains of areas from previous games and discovering that the past was still present beneath the shiny new facility. This layering was both literal and metaphorical, representing how Fazbear Entertainment had attempted to bury its past and build something new on top of it without ever truly addressing or resolving the tragedies that had occurred. The past refused to stay buried, continuing to influence and corrupt the present. One of the most significant lore reveals in Security Breach was the presence of Burntrap in the underground ruins, heavily implied to be William Afton in yet another form. Despite being burned in Pizzeria Simulator and seemingly transferred into the digital realm as Glitchtrap, some form of Afton persisted in the physical world as well. His corpse fused with damaged animatronic parts and new technology, creating a horrifying amalgamation that continued to exist decades after his original death. Burntrap's presence suggested that William Afton existed in multiple forms simultaneously, both as a physical undead horror and as a digital virus, making him seemingly impossible to truly destroy. This persistence reinforced the theme that some evil refuses to die, that Afton's actions had created consequences that would continue indefinitely. Security Breach featured multiple endings depending on player choices and actions, ranging from simple escape endings where Gregory left the Pizzaplex, to more complex endings involving confronting Burntrap, saving Vanessa, or discovering deeper secrets. The true ending involved descending into the ruins, confronting Burntrap in a final battle, and potentially freeing Vanessa from Glitchtrap's control. The presence of the Blob, a massive amalgamation of animatronic parts and spirits from previous games, suggested that the souls from earlier entries had not all been freed despite the events of Pizzeria Simulator, that some remained trapped and twisted into new forms. The multiple endings approach gave players agency but also made the canon storyline ambiguous, with the community debating which ending should be considered the true continuation of the story. The DLC content for Security Breach, titled Ruin and released in July 2023, continued the story by introducing Cassie, a new protagonist searching for Gregory in the abandoned Pizzaplex months after the main game's events. Ruin was darker and more focused on traditional horror than the base game, showing the Pizzaplex fallen into disrepair with damaged animatronics and hazardous conditions. The DLC revealed more about the Mimic, an advanced AI that could imitate voices and behaviors, suggesting it had been imitating Gregory to lure Cassie into the Pizzaplex for unknown purposes. Ruin's ending was dark, with Cassie apparently trapped or betrayed, left calling for help in the ruins. The DLC showed that Steel Wool could deliver more traditional Five Nights at Freddy's horror when focused on that goal, addressing some criticism of the base game's lighter tone. The reception of Security Breach was mixed, with praise for its ambition, scale, and emotional moments but criticism for technical issues at launch, bugs, and the feeling that the game had been rushed despite lengthy development. The tonal shift toward accessibility created debate within the community about whether the franchise should embrace a younger audience or maintain its horror focus. Some fans appreciated the emotional story of Gregory and Glamrock Freddy, while others felt the game had strayed too far from what made the franchise special. The technical problems were particularly frustrating given the long development time, with many feeling the game needed more polish before release. Patches and updates improved the experience over time, but the launch issues affected the game's reputation. Despite its flaws, Security Breach succeeded in advancing the story and exploring new gameplay possibilities for the franchise. The Pizzaplex was an impressive environment that created a sense of scale and modernity, showing how Fazbear Entertainment might look in the contemporary era. The relationship between Gregory and Glamrock Freddy was genuinely touching, providing hope and warmth that contrasted with the franchise's typically dark tone. The game's accessibility brought new fans into the franchise who might have been intimidated by earlier entries' difficulty or horror intensity. Security Breach expanded the potential audience for Five Nights at Freddy's, while attempting to maintain enough connections to established lore to satisfy longtime fans. A difficult balancing act that was partially successful. The ongoing development of Security Breach content and the continuation of the story through Ruin showed that Steel Wool and Scott remained committed to exploring this era of the franchise's timeline. The modern setting allowed for exploration of contemporary fears and issues while maintaining connections to the tragic past that defined the franchise's lore. The technological horror of Glitchtrap and the Mimic, the corporate megacomplex of the Pizzaplex, and the continuing influence of William Afton created a story that felt both fresh and connected to the franchise's roots. Security Breach represented a transition point for Five Nights at Freddy's, moving the franchise forward into new territory while grappling with how to honor its past and satisfy diverse audience expectations. The impact of Five Nights at Freddy's extended far beyond the games themselves to create one of the most remarkable fan communities in gaming history, a collective of millions of people united by their love of the franchise and their dedication to exploring every aspect of its universe. The community formed organically through shared interest in the game's mysteries, growing from small groups discussing theories on forums to a massive, worldwide phenomenon with dedicated spaces on every major platform. Reddit communities for Five Nights at Freddy's grew to hundreds of thousands of members, with daily discussions about lore, fan creations, and news. Discord servers brought fans together for real-time conversation and collaboration. YouTube channels dedicated to the franchise amassed millions of subscribers, with every new game release generating thousands of reaction videos, playthroughs, and theory analysis videos. The creative output of the Five Nights at Freddy's community was staggering in its volume and quality. Fan artists produced tens of thousands of pieces of artwork, ranging from faithful recreations of official designs to completely original interpretations of characters and scenes. The art style varied wildly, from horror-focused pieces that emphasized the terrifying aspects of the animatronics to cute, chibi-style interpretations that soften the characters into adorable versions. Some artists specialized in humanized versions of the animatronics, creating designs that translated the robots into human characters while maintaining recognizable traits and personalities. The variety of artistic interpretation showed how the franchise had become a shared creative space where fans felt ownership and freedom to reimagine characters in ways that resonated personally. Fan fiction writers created thousands of stories exploring the Five Nights at Freddy's universe from every possible angle. Some stories remained faithful to canon, filling gaps in the official timeline or exploring perspectives of minor characters. Others created alternate universes where events transpired differently, where characters survived who died in canon, or where entirely different scenarios played out. The emotional range of fan fiction spanned from dark horror stories that leaned into the franchise's terrifying elements to heartwarming stories about the animatronics finding peace or developing relationships. The most popular fan fictions garnered thousands of readers and comments, creating mini-fandoms within the larger community. The fan game development community for Five Nights at Freddy's was particularly notable, with hundreds of fan-made games created using the franchise as inspiration or directly featuring its characters and settings. Some fan games attempted to recreate the original game's formula with new twists, creating survival horror experiences with original characters and stories inspired by Scott's work. Others experimented with completely different genres, creating RPGs, adventure games, and even dating simulators set in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. A few fan games achieved significant popularity in their own right, with titles like Five Nights at Candy's, The Joy of Creation, and Pop Goes becoming well-known within the community and attracting their own dedicated fan bases. Scott's supportive attitude toward fan games, offering encouragement and occasionally featuring notable projects on his website, fostered this creative community and encouraged developers to pursue their visions. The music community surrounding Five Nights at Freddy's produced an enormous catalog of songs, from rock anthems to electronic dance tracks to emotional ballads, all exploring the characters and lore of the franchise. The Living Tombstone's Five Nights at Freddy's song became a viral phenomenon with over 500 million views on YouTube, introducing countless people to the franchise through music. Other artists like JT Music, Tryhard Ninja, Groundbreaking, and many more created extensive catalogs of Five Nights at Freddy's music, with some artists producing dozens of songs exploring different characters, time periods, and themes from the games. The music videos often featured elaborate animations depicting scenes from the games or original interpretations of the story, creating multimedia experiences that fans returned to repeatedly. The songs became part of how fans understood and connected with the lore, with memorable lyrics and emotional performances adding depth to character interpretations. The educational value of engaging with Five Nights at Freddy's lore, though never intended as educational content, taught valuable skills to countless fans, particularly younger audience members developing critical thinking abilities. The complex timeline and hidden secrets required careful analysis, attention to detail, and the ability to synthesize information from multiple sources. Fans learned to construct arguments supported by evidence, to revise theories when new information emerged, and to collaborate with others who might have different interpretations. The process of solving the franchise's mysteries was essentially a massive, crowdsourced investigation where participants practiced skills valuable in academic and professional contexts. The fact that this learning happened through entertainment rather than formal education made it engaging and memorable in ways that traditional instruction might not achieve. The Game Theorists channel, hosted by MatPat, became almost synonymous with Five Nights at Freddy's theory crafting, producing over 30 dedicated videos analyzing the franchise's lore over several years. MatPat's theories ranged from attempts to create complete timelines to analyses of specific characters and events to wild speculation about hidden meanings and connections. Some theories became widely accepted within the community while others were debated or disproven, but all contributed to the ongoing conversation about the franchise's mysteries. MatPat's relationship with Scott Cawthon and the franchise was unique, with Scott occasionally confirming or denying specific theories and even creating content that responded to or built upon ideas presented in theory videos. This interaction between creator and theorist created a feedback loop where each influenced the other, with the franchise evolving partly in response to community interpretation. The merchandise success of Five Nights at Freddy's demonstrated the franchise's crossover appeal and commercial viability beyond games. Action figures, plushies, clothing, accessories, posters, and countless other products filled store shelves, generating significant revenue and keeping the franchise visible between game releases. The merchandise was surprisingly diverse in its appeal, with horror-focused collectibles targeting adult fans and cute plushies appealing to children who loved the characters despite their frightening origins. This broad market appeal was unusual for a horror franchise and demonstrated how Five Nights at Freddy's had transcended its genre to become something that different audiences could engage with in different ways. Parents sometimes struggled to understand why their young children loved these characters from horror games, but the phenomenon made sense within the context of how the community had embraced and reinterpreted the animatronics as sympathetic figures rather than purely threatening monsters. The book series that expanded the Five Nights at Freddy's universe brought the franchise to audiences who might not be gamers but enjoyed reading horror fiction. The original novel trilogy, co-authored by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed-Riley, presented an alternate timeline that explored similar themes and characters through a different narrative lens. The books focused on Charlie, the daughter of Henry Emily, and her friends as they investigated the mysteries surrounding Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. While not directly connected to the game timeline, the books explored concepts and revelations that informed understanding of the games, including details about how animatronics functioned and how possession worked within the universe's rules. The books allowed for more explicit horror and character development than the game's minimalist storytelling, providing a different way to experience the franchise's dark atmosphere. The Fazbear Frights anthology series expanded further, with each book containing 3 short stories set in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. These stories ranged from directly relevant to the main lore to standalone horror tales that used the franchise's concepts and atmosphere without necessarily connecting to the main timeline. The variety of stories allowed exploration of different types of horror and different aspects of the universe, from body horror to psychological terror to tragic drama. Some stories provided crucial lore information about concepts like Remnant and how the supernatural elements of the franchise functioned, making them essential reading for dedicated lore enthusiasts despite being marketed as side content. The success of the book series proved that Five Nights at Freddy's had become a true multimedia franchise with dedicated audiences across different media. The representation of Five Nights at Freddy's in broader pop culture showed how deeply the franchise had penetrated collective consciousness beyond gaming communities. References to Freddy Fazbear and the animatronics appeared in television shows, other video games, and online content across platforms. The phrase Five Nights became associated with survival horror scenarios in confined spaces, with other games explicitly referencing or parodying the formula Scott had established. The animatronics, particularly Freddy himself, became recognizable icons of indie horror, as familiar to many people as classic horror movie monsters. The franchise had achieved a level of cultural saturation that few indie games ever reach, becoming part of the shared cultural vocabulary of internet-native generations. The cosplay community embraced Five Nights at Freddy's enthusiastically, with elaborate costumes of the animatronics appearing at conventions and in online content. Creating accurate animatronic costumes required significant skill and resources, with cosplayers building suits that replicated the characters' mechanical appearances, glowing eyes, and distinctive features. Some cosplayers created wearable versions that allowed them to move and perform, while others built display pieces that prioritized accuracy over mobility. The variety of characters and their distinct designs provided numerous options for cosplayers of different skill levels and preferences, from the original animatronics to the twisted nightmare versions to the more modern glamrock designs. Five Nights at Freddy's cosplay became a recognized category at conventions, with cosplayers gathering for group photos and creating elaborate performance pieces. The speedrunning community discovered optimization challenges within Five Nights at Freddy's games, developing strategies to complete games in minimal time and competing for world records. While not as prominent in speedrunning as some other franchises, the Five Nights at Freddy's games offered unique challenges that appealed to optimization-focused players. The randomness of animatronic movement patterns created variability that made consistent speedruns difficult, requiring adaptation and strategy beyond simple memorization. The custom night challenges with maximum difficulty settings became legendary within the community, with completion considered a badge of honor demonstrating exceptional skill and nerves. Players like Esty, Dawko, and DJ Sturf became known for their incredible skills and their completion of challenges that seemed nearly impossible, with their achievement videos garnering hundreds of thousands of views from impressed community members. The animation community created perhaps some of the most impressive fan content, producing professional quality animated series, music videos, and short films based on the franchise. Creators like Enchanted Mob produced elaborate animated music videos featuring the animatronics in cinematic scenarios. Others created ongoing animated series that told original stories within the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, developing complex narratives with character development and emotional arcs. The quality of some fan animations rivaled or exceeded official promotional content, demonstrating the incredible talent present within the community. These animations often garnered millions of views and introduced new fans to the franchise who discovered it through animated content rather than through the games themselves. The charity work and positive community initiatives surrounding Five Nights at Freddy's showed that fan communities could be forces for good beyond simply celebrating shared interests. Fans organized charity streams, fundraisers, and events that used their love of the franchise to raise money and awareness for various causes. Scott Cawthon himself was known for his charitable donations and support of various organizations, setting an example of using success to help others. The community created positive spaces where people could connect over shared interests, form friendships, and find belonging. For many fans, particularly younger people, the Five Nights at Freddy's community became an important social space where they could express creativity, develop skills, and form meaningful connections with others who shared their passion. The franchise had created not just entertainment but a global community that transcended the games themselves to become something meaningful in participants' lives. Scott Cawthon's personal journey through the creation and expansion of Five Nights at Freddy's was as remarkable as the franchise itself, a story of persistence, redemption, and ultimately the complicated relationship between creators and their audiences in the modern era. Scott remained relatively private despite the massive success of his creation, choosing to engage with the community primarily through his games and occasional online posts rather than seeking celebrity or constantly promoting himself. He was known for his humility, often expressing surprise at the franchise's success and gratitude for the community that had embraced his work. This modest approach endeared him to many fans who appreciated that he seemed genuinely more interested in creating content than in building a personal brand or seeking attention. The rapid development pace that characterized the franchise's early years took a significant toll on Scott, who worked essentially alone on the first several games while also managing his responsibilities as a father and Christian. The pressure to maintain momentum, to deliver new content while the franchise was hot, to respond to fan expectations and theories, was immense. Scott spoke in interviews about the challenges of this period, the long hours of work, the stress of trying to meet impossible deadlines, and the fear that each game might be the one where he failed to deliver. The fact that he maintained quality while producing games at such a breakneck pace was testament to his dedication and skill, but it was not sustainable long-term and contributed to his eventual decision to step back from hands-on development. Scott's relationship with the community was unique and often touching, with numerous stories of his kindness and generosity emerging over the years. He donated substantial amounts to charity, often anonymously or without seeking recognition. He supported indie game developers, offering advice and encouragement to those trying to follow similar paths. He engaged with fan theories and discussions, occasionally dropping hints or confirmations that guided community investigation of the lore. He acknowledged and appreciated fan creations, featuring notable fan games and content on his website and in communications. This accessibility and kindness created deep loyalty among fans who felt that Scott genuinely cared about the community and wasn't just interested in commercial exploitation of the franchise. The transition from solo developer to overseer of a larger franchise involved significant changes in Scott's role and relationships with his creation. As the games became more technically ambitious and the demands of multiple simultaneous projects grew, Scott began partnering with professional studios like Steelwool Studios to handle development, while he focused on story, design oversight, and creative direction. This transition allowed for more polished and ambitious projects, but also meant less direct control over every aspect of production. Scott had to learn to delegate, to trust other developers to realize his vision, and to provide guidance without micromanaging. This evolution from solo creator to creative director was necessary for the franchise's continued growth, but represented a significant personal and professional change. The controversy that emerged in June 2021 regarding Scott's political donations was a defining moment in his relationship with the community and in his public life. Public records revealed that Scott had donated to various political candidates and causes, some associated with positions that parts of the fanbase found objectionable. The revelation sparked intense debate within the community, with some fans feeling betrayed or hurt by Scott's political choices, while others defended his right to participate in politics according to his own beliefs. The controversy highlighted the complicated relationship between creators and audiences in the modern era, where personal beliefs and actions can become subjects of public scrutiny and where fans often expect alignment between creators' politics and their own values. Scott's response to the controversy was direct and personal, posting a statement explaining his reasoning for his donations and defending his choices while acknowledging that he understood why some people were upset. He explained his political positions as coming from his values and beliefs, that he had donated to candidates he believed would be effective leaders even when he disagreed with them on some issues, and that he had supported various causes including LGBTQ rights through other donations and actions. The statement was honest and refused to simply apologize or backtrack, instead standing by his decisions while expressing understanding of different perspectives. The response was praised by some as principled and honest, while criticized by others as insufficient or defensive. The aftermath of the controversy included harassment directed at Scott and his family, with some individuals crossing lines from legitimate criticism into threats and personal attacks. The severity of this harassment contributed to Scott's decision to step back from public presence and game development, announcing his semi-retirement from the franchise he had created. In his retirement announcement, Scott explained that he wanted to spend more time with his family, that he was financially secure enough to step back, and that he believed the franchise was in good hands with the teams currently working on projects. The announcement was bittersweet, with fans appreciating Scott's contributions while respecting his decision to prioritize his personal life and safety. Scott's statement about stepping back included assurances that he would remain involved in the franchise's creative direction even if not actively developing games, that projects already in development would continue, and that he had confidence in the people taking over primary development responsibilities. He acknowledged the controversy without dwelling on it, focusing instead on the positive aspects of the franchise and the community. The tone was one of gratitude for the journey, pride in what had been accomplished, and optimism for the franchise's future even as he reduced his personal involvement. The retirement was not complete withdrawal but rather a transition to a less public, less demanding role that would allow him to maintain creative input while reclaiming personal time and privacy. The community response to Scott's semi-retirement was mixed and emotional. Many fans expressed gratitude for everything he had created, for the years of entertainment and mystery, for building a franchise that had become meaningful in their lives. Some understood and supported his decision to prioritize family and personal well-being over continued intense involvement in game development. Others felt abandoned or frustrated that the controversy had led to this outcome, believing that a more engaged response or clearer political positions might have resolved the situation differently. The diversity of responses reflected the diversity of the community itself, with millions of people each having their own relationship with the franchise and its creator. The legacy Scott Cawthon left on indie game development extended beyond just Five Nights at Freddy's to influence an entire generation of developers. His story proved that solo developers could achieve massive success through creativity and understanding of their audience rather than through large budgets or established industry connections. The rapid development cycle he maintained during the franchise's early years, while not necessarily healthy or sustainable, demonstrated that one person could produce substantial content when driven and focused. His willingness to engage with the community, to acknowledge fan theories and creativity, and to evolve his creation in response to audience interest became a model for how indie developers could build passionate fan bases through interaction and mutual respect. The business approach Scott took with Five Nights at Freddy's also provided lessons for other indie developers. He priced his games affordably, making them accessible to a wide audience including younger players with limited money. He frequently provided free updates and bonus content rather than charging for every edition, building goodwill and demonstrating respect for players. He supported the franchise's expansion into other media and merchandise, understanding that multiple revenue streams could sustain a franchise long-term while also providing diverse ways for fans to engage with characters and stories. His approach balanced commercial success with artistic integrity and community respect, showing that financial success and maintaining creative values were not mutually exclusive. Scott's faith and values were apparent throughout his work and life, from his early Christian game development to the moral themes present in Five Nights at Freddy's about consequences, redemption, and justice. While he never used the franchise as explicit religious messaging, the underlying values of right and wrong, the importance of facing consequences, and the possibility of redemption were consistent with his stated beliefs. His charitable work and his attempts to use his success to help others reflected values of service and generosity. The controversy around his political donations was partly rooted in perceived contradictions between his stated values and his political choices, highlighting how complex the relationship between personal faith, political action, and public perception can be. The future of Scott Cawthon's involvement with Five Nights at Freddy's remains somewhat uncertain even after his retirement announcement, with occasional updates suggesting continued behind-the-scenes involvement in major decisions and story direction. He retained ownership and creative control of the franchise while delegating day-to-day development to other teams. This arrangement allowed him to maintain influence over the franchise's direction while reducing the intense workload that had characterized his early years with the series. The model of creator stepping back while maintaining oversight was similar to how other successful franchise creators had transitioned from active development to advisory roles, allowing their creations to continue evolving while they pursued other interests or simply enjoyed the success they had earned. The impact Scott had on those who worked with him and on the indie development community was evident in the statements and tributes from other developers and collaborators. People who had worked with Scott described him as professional, creative, and genuinely kind, someone who treated others with respect and supported their work. Indie developers who followed similar paths often cited Scott and Five Nights at Freddy's as inspiration, proof that independent creation could succeed against industry giants. The franchise he created would likely outlive his active involvement, continuing to evolve and grow with new creators bringing their visions while building on the foundation he had established. Scott Cawthon's legacy was secure, his place in gaming history assured as the creator of one of the most successful and culturally significant indie franchises ever made. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's is ultimately a story that refuses to end, a narrative about horror that persists, evil that will not die, and the impossibility of truly escaping the consequences of terrible actions. From the murdered children trapped in animatronic suits for decades to William Afton surviving death in multiple forms across centuries, the franchise's central theme has always been that some wounds never heal, some tragedies continue to echo forward, and some evils prove impossible to completely